My son stood on stage at his black tie gala and smiled at 250 people. "How much?" he said into the microphone. "Do you think this man earns per year?" My photo filled the screen behind him. Grease-stained coveralls, calloused hands bent over an engine. "Bidding starts at $1 for a dinner date with my dull fisherman father. $1. Get a good look at those coveralls. Don't be shy, people." 250 guests dissolved into laughter. I was tucked away at a rear table, wearing my late wife's coat unseen, and I kept my mouth shut. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where quiet men finally get their say. If stories like this one hit close to home for you, I'd be glad if you'd consider subscribing and leaving a like. It costs nothing, and it means more than you'd think. Before we go any further, has someone you loved ever underestimated you so completely that you had to decide whether to correct them or simply let them find out on their own? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. One more thing before we begin. Some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of telling it well. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. It's the truth underneath the story that matters, and that part is real enough. 40 years of the same ritual coffee going in my Rockport workshop before the sun was properly up. 4 scoops in the percolator water to the line, then heat until the smell cut through whatever salt air the harbor sent my way. June 2nd, a Friday, and a marine diesel I'd been nursing back to life sat waiting on the workbench. I am not the kind of man who needs applause for doing his job. Either the engine runs when I'm done with it or it doesn't. Either my hands are good enough or they aren't. Nobody has to watch. I lifted Norma's navy pea coat from the hook near the door and let its familiar weight settle across my back. She'd picked it up for $95 at a shop in Salem in 2003, talked the clerk down from $120. Walt, she'd told me, pressing it flat against my chest right there in that narrow aisle. "This makes you look like someone worth listening to." I wore it for the warmth and because her hands had chosen it. 8 years since I lost her, and if I raised the collar to my face, I could still catch something faint lavender hand cream. The list assembled itself the way it sometimes did when honest work occupied my hands. Those who had tried to shrink me. The shipyard foreman when I was 26 who said men like me didn't open their own shops. Grease monkeys stayed grease monkeys. I was gone in 3 months and had my own sign over the door not long after. The 3 banks in 1977 that passed on my loan application, every one of them deciding a boat mechanic was too poor a bet. I bought my equipment with cash and earned the reputation engine by engine. The business partner in 1990 who walked off with my client list grinning the whole time, confident I'd never recover. I rebuilt that list inside 6 months. He was shuttered in 8. And the cardiologist in 2015 who set down my cholesterol results and suggested I start slowing down, perhaps think about retirement, begin making peace with my limits. I was 64. I overhauled a 38-foot sailboat engine the next week, and the owner sent me a bottle of bourbon and a note saying it ran smoother than the day he bought it. 71 years. Not one of those people ever succeeded in making me feel small. I put down the coffee mug and held the diesel injector assembly up in my calloused hands. What exactly is the measure of a man who has spent 7 decades proving nothing to anyone? I didn't have an answer. What I had was this: I'd never once needed a room full of strangers to confirm my own worth, and I'd always thought of that as a quiet kind of dignity, the sort that has no use for a stage. But 71 years of building something like that, I was about to find out, can come apart in 71 seconds when it's your own son swinging the hammer. The phone rang at 9:30. The old wall-mounted phone cream, colored and heavy, a relic Norma refused to replace because she said it had character. I cleaned my hands on a shop rag and picked up the receiver. My son's given name was Derek Allen Craddock, but Norma began calling him Drew before he could walk, and the name fit the man he became far better than the one on his birth certificate. I saved Derek for moments that required him to remember himself before the titles and the business cards started accumulating. At 39, Drew spoke like someone auditioning for elected office, even over something as ordinary as breakfast. "I'm glad I caught you." "Son, I'm always here," I said. "The workshop doesn't exactly move on you." "Right. Listen, Dad, I need to ask you something. There's a charity gala 3 weeks from tonight. It's a big one. Harborside Pavilion right on the Salem waterfront. I'm running the Coastal Conservation Alliance now, executive director. Did I mention that? Anyway, it's our annual fundraiser. Black tie, 250 guests, and I need you there, Dad. This is the most important night of my career. I need family in the room. That word landed somewhere behind my ribs and stuck there like a boat hook. Need. My son needed me. 4 months of silence between us, and before that 6. Our calls had thinned down to quarterly events, him phoning in from whatever city had him that week. Me listening while he ran through initiatives, stakeholders, impact metrics. Half of it I couldn't decode, but I could hear the competence underneath it. And that was the part that mattered. Of course I'll be there, I told him. Out before I'd weighed it, wouldn't miss it. Seriously, Dad, that's great, really. Something in his voice sounded like genuine relief, or genuine pleasure, or some honest version of something. Black tie. I know that's not your world, but it matters. June 23rd, 7 o'clock, your name will be at the door. And bring the peacoat if it's running cold that evening, the navy one Mom found you. You wear that well. I caught something in how he said it. Not the words so much as the delivery, that small stress on if it's running cold the easy way. He brought up the coat as if he'd already placed me in the picture, already thought through my entrance. I told myself I was making something out of nothing. This was my son. He'd asked me to come. That was what mattered. I'll be there. Thanks, Dad. I really mean it. This matters to me. We said our goodbyes and I settled the receiver back. The workshop closed around its own quiet, nothing but distant gulls working the harbor. I looked at Norma's peacoat on its hook and sat with a feeling I couldn't quite label. Something like pride or maybe hope, or that specific foolishness that visits a man when he lets himself believe his child still counts him as someone worth knowing. I had no way of knowing yet that the coat would pass through 3 different rooms before the summer was done. No way of knowing that the same man who'd just called me would stand me up in front of 250 people and point. No way of knowing that 71 years of quiet dignity could be unraveled by a single punchline landing in a room full of people who'd never picked up a wrench. Only thing I knew was that my son had invited me, and I'd wear the coat Norma chose for me because she said it made me look like someone worth listening to. 3 weeks until I'd be standing at table 18 among people who kept a very different ledger of a man's value, and I'd find out what it does to you when the one who cuts you down to nothing is the one you spent your life raising. The weeks moved the way weeks do. Engines on the bench, coffee before dawn, the peacoat thrown on against the chill. Then it was Friday, and I pointed my truck towards Salem. The Harborside Pavilion on a warm June evening was precisely the kind of place a man in a 20-year-old Navy peacoat was not meant to be. Windows ran floor to ceiling over the waterfront. Crystal chandeliers broke the light into pieces that fell across 250 guests drifting through the room as if they'd always known exactly where they belonged. Vivian Craddock found me before I'd located Drew. 37 years old, flawless in a designer gown. My son's wife offered me a smile so thoroughly constructed it might have come off an assembly line. We'd crossed paths twice before maybe a third time. She had never appeared to be keeping track. Walter, she said, her fingertips settling on my arm through the wool like something cold. You made it. Let me take you to your seat. She guided me past tables 1 through 17. Every one of them angled for clean views of the stage and the harbor beyond the glass. Then she stopped. A table wedged completely behind a thick marble pillar at the back of the room. Table 18. You'll find it much more comfortable here, Vivian said. The speakers can be a bit much closer to the stage. I sat down. Harriet Baxter, somewhere in her 50s and well put together, glanced up from her phone, gave me a courteous nod, and went back to whatever held her attention. A couple from Marblehead made a brief attempt at small talk before the wine drew them back. Not one of them registered that I was the only man in the room without a tuxedo. Drew appeared 20 minutes on 39, polished in ways I'd never tried to be. Dad, he caught my shoulder. You're here. Good to see you. Glad you made it. Wouldn't have missed it, I said. He was gone again before I could ask how to find him at dinner. The pillar swallowed most of my sightlines, but sound carried laughter glass on glass. A jazz trio warming the room. The salad arrived, and I ate it and reminded myself this was fine. He had a full plate tonight. I was here, and that was the thing that counted. That mattered. Then Drew stepped up to the podium. He was compelling coastal conservation endangered ecosystems. Massachusetts's maritime heritage laid out with the confidence of a man who owned every room he walked into. 250 donors gave him the focused silence of people who'd paid to be persuaded. I felt proud. My son knew how to hold a room. But just before the auction opened, Drew's voice changed register. Before we get to the main event, he said, I want to try something with everyone tonight. A large LED screen rolled down at his back, and there I was, not how I looked that evening. How I looked in my shop. Coveralls dark with grease, both hands black with diesel oil leaning hard over an engine block. Another image me in a hardware store. Another one pushing a lawnmower. Take a close look at this man, Drew said. How much do you think he earns per year? The room laughed warm, sophisticated amusement at something they took to be harmless. Someone called out 30,000. 40, a woman near the window offered. Do I hear 50? Drew asked, working the room like an auctioneer. Come on, folks, be generous. Get a look at those coveralls. 71 years. Not one person had managed to make me feel small until my son accomplished it on a Friday evening in June. Ladies and gentlemen, Drew said, you are being far too generous, but that warmth is exactly what makes tonight so special. A beat, and then tonight's opening auction item. The screen shifted. My face filled the wall behind him, blown up until every wrinkle and patch of weather-beaten skin became something like architecture. I'm auctioning off an evening with my boring fisherman dad, Drew announced. Dinner conversation, whatever stories he feels like sharing. Opening bid $1 because honestly that feels generous. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. That was the thing that made it so hard to sit with. They believed this was affectionate. I could see it moving across their faces. Indulgent smiles, soft chuckles, small glances exchanged between tables as if they were all in on something charming. Stand up, Dad, Drew called from the stage. Give everyone a look. I stood. The pillar cut me off from most of the room, but enough faces turned my way that I felt all 250 of them. I held my expression the way 71 years had trained me to. Smiling is sometimes the only form of dignity still available to a man. Somewhere deep and quiet inside me, something old made a decision it would not walk back from. $1 from the gentleman at table 7, Drew said. Do I hear 2? More laughter. Someone bid $3. Someone else came in at 5. The joke was the point. Drive the number down into absurdity so the absurdity could do the work of saying what everyone was thinking. Then a voice came from table 1, the VIP section nearest the harbor windows, and it cut through everything. Clear, unhurried final, $1 million. The room didn't simply go quiet. It stopped. Garrison Aldrich rose with the stillness of a man who has nothing left to prove. 72 years old, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit without a tie. He occupied table 1 with the particular weight of someone who had spent 50 years commanding attention without once having to ask for it. He looked directly at my son. Did someone say 1 million? Drew's stage smile stayed fixed while his eyes worked to catch up with what he'd just heard. You heard me correctly, Mr. Craddock, Garrison said. $1 million for dinner with that gentleman. 250 people froze, mid-laugh, mid-sip, mid-breath. Drew stood at the podium holding a microphone he appeared to have forgotten the purpose of. The silver-haired man at table 1 looked out across the ballroom and found me, and something passed between us in that moment that I had no word for. Yet, though I would spend the next 6 months searching for one. I did not know who he was. I could not begin to explain why a stranger had just offered a fortune for dinner with a fisherman in a 20-year-old coat. Drew's voice returned first, with the rest of him following about 3 seconds behind. Did someone actually say 1 million? His grip on the microphone had gone white-knuckled. The polished delivery was gone. What the stage held now was a 39-year-old man whose prepared remarks had left the building entirely. Garrison Aldrich remained on his feet at table 1, both hands relaxed at his sides. You heard correctly, Mr. Craddock. $1 million for dinner with that gentleman at table 18. 250 heads turned back and forth between the silver-haired man in the dark suit and the fisherman in the navy peacoat. The silence stretched until Eugene Hadfield, serving as the Gala's master of ceremonies, stepped forward in an expensive tuxedo to formalize what nobody in the room could quite absorb. Going once, Hadfield said, his voice unsteady. Going twice sold to the gentleman at table 1. The room held its silence 1 beat longer. Then a careful round of applause moved through it. The kind of applause that fills a room when people don't know what else to do with their hands. Garrison didn't sit. He turned to face the ballroom, and his posture alone commanded the kind of attention Drew's microphone had been working all evening to earn. I have spent 5 decades in rooms alongside the most formidable people in this country, Garrison said, his voice reaching every corner without effort. Senators, chief executives, federal judges, people who constructed empires, and people who simply received them. Tonight I watched a man absorb ridicule with more grace than I have seen from any of them. He paused. The room had gone so quiet I could make out the harbor water moving against the pilings outside. Then Garrison looked directly across the crowd at me and continued. That, he said, is worth considerably more than $1 million. 71 years of moving quietly through the world, and in 60 seconds a stranger had seen me more plainly than my own son. The applause that came now was different, fuller, rising. Several people at the front tables got to their feet. Within moments, half the room had joined them, and I understood they weren't applauding Garrison's bid. They were applauding the permission he had handed them to reconsider what they'd been laughing at 3 minutes before. I rose from table 18 and buttoned the pea coat. Harriet Baxter, who had barely acknowledged my presence all evening, was watching me now with an expression I couldn't quite place. The couple from Marblehead leaned together, whispering. I nodded in their direction and made my way toward the exit. Drew caught up with me near the doors, coming quickly off the stage. Dad, wait, I need to... Good speech, son, I said, not breaking stride. You had them all with you. That's not... I didn't mean for it to. It was supposed to be funny. I stopped at the door and looked at him. Actually looked. There was a faint shine of perspiration under the stage lighting and something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Fear, maybe, or the first edge of understanding. I'll call you tomorrow, I said. Then I pushed through into the June night and let the door fall shut. The waterfront air carried salt and diesel, and that particular lightness that settles over a man when he walks away from a room full of people who have just decided they want to know his name. I drove home to Rockport and let the phone ring when Drew called at 10:30 and again at 11:15. Saturday passed in the workshop with my hands in honest work rebuilding a water pump that had cracked from winter freeze. I kept returning to Garrison Aldrich's face when he stood, the steadiness in his voice, the way he'd looked at me as though he was already certain of something I hadn't figured out yet. Sunday morning the phone rang at 8:15 just as I was getting the coffee going. Mr. Craddock, said a woman's voice, professional, precise. My name is Colleen Ferris. I am the executive assistant to Garrison Aldrich. Colleen Ferris spoke with the measured calm of someone who had spent 11 years as the practiced barrier between a billionaire and everyone else on Earth. Her tone made clear she placed calls of this kind regularly and expected them to be received as the privileges they were. Mr. Whitfield would like to invite you to breakfast tomorrow morning if you're available. There is a restaurant on Shore Road in Marblehead, no exterior signage, reservations required. I'll send you the address. Tomorrow, I said. Monday. Yes, Mr. Aldrich is eager to speak with you regarding a matter of some importance. Would 8 o'clock suit you? Why would a man I had never laid eyes on bid a fortune for dinner with a retired diesel mechanic? Why would he defend me in front of 250 strangers? Why would his assistant be calling 36 hours later with the efficiency of someone running a plan that had been drawn up well before the gala? I'll be there, I said. Excellent. Mr. Aldrich will be very pleased. The restaurant, she told me, was called The Ledge. No signage. Valet parking available but not required. Business casual would be appropriate. She ended the call before I could form a question. 10 seconds later, my phone buzzed with an address and a map pin. I stood at the kitchen window looking out toward Rockport Harbor. Morning light hit the water the way it always does, indifferent to whether anyone's watching. Colleen Ferris had not explained her employer's bid. She hadn't asked whether I knew Garrison Aldrich or what might connect us, or whether I had any idea what I'd walked into. She had simply proceeded on the assumption that I would say yes the way you proceed on the assumption that the tide will come in. I tried to remember the last time anyone had assumed something like that about me. It had been a very long time. Monday morning would bring answers, or perhaps only more complicated questions. Either way, I would wear the peacoat Norma had picked out, and I would sit across a table from a man who had somehow seen me clearly on a night when my own son had not. That struck me as a reasonable place to begin. Monday morning, I drove to Marblehead following the pin Colleen Ferris had sent. The restaurant on Shore Road carried no name on its door, which told me everything I needed to know about the clientele. I nearly missed it entirely. From the outside, it resembled a private home, weathered shingles, flower boxes beneath the windows, a gravel lot holding 6 vehicles that together were worth more than my house. Only the small brass number beside the entrance matched the address on my phone. Inside 6 tables, floor-to-ceiling glass, facing the Atlantic and Garrison Aldrich already waiting in a corner booth. He rose when I came through the door and offered his hand. The grip was solid without making a point of it. Thank you for coming, Walter, he said. I imagine this feels somewhat out of the ordinary. Your assistant mentioned there was no sign, I replied. She wasn't wrong. The people who belong here know where to look. He gestured to the seat across from him. The coffee is worth staying for. They roasted on the premises. A cup of black coffee arrived before I had confirmed I wanted one. Owen, the only server I could see, moved through the room with the practiced discretion of someone who understood his function, perfectly present when necessary, gone when not. The coffee was as advertised excellent. Garrison studied me briefly, then said, "I have been trying to reach you for 12 years, Walter. Every conventional approach came to nothing. Phone numbers disconnected. Letters returned unopened. I began to think you'd moved abroad or reinvented yourself entirely." "I don't reinvent myself," I said, "but I did stop picking up certain calls." "May I ask why?" I set the cup down. "In 2009, a well-dressed man came into my shop in Rockport. Expensive suit canvas duffel bag worn soft at the handles, business cards from a firm I'd never encountered. He laid out talk of industrial investment opportunities, marine equipment contracts, expanding the operation. Framed it all in the language of exactly what a diesel mechanic who'd spent 30 years working alone might want to hear. Something sharpened behind Garrison's eyes without changing his expression. "I gave him $15,000, I continued. "He was gone the next morning. The company didn't exist. The business cards had been printed at a coffee shop in Salem. After that, I stopped returning calls from numbers I didn't recognize, blocked anything unknown. If I couldn't place your voice or your name, you didn't get through." "That explains why Friday night was necessary," Garrison said quietly. "You would never have taken my call." "No," I agreed. "I wouldn't have." The walls I'd built after 2009 weren't constructed out of bitterness, more like basic arithmetic. One swindle per lifetime seemed like a fair limit. Garrison settled back slightly. "I need to tell you about someone, a mutual friend, a man I believe you once knew very well." He paused, watching my face, then said the name, Doyle Cavett. I set the coffee cup down without looking at where I was placing it. It was the first visible crack in my composure since I'd walked in, and I knew he'd caught it. "I haven't heard that name in 11 years, I said. Doyle Cavett. The name came at me like cold water breaking over a bow, sudden and total, washing back through decades in 4 syllables. My college roommate at the University of Massachusetts. Best man at my wedding. The person I had trusted enough to wire $75,000 without a contract or a guarantee of any kind. The friend who phoned every year on my birthday until 2011, then went silent, and I never learned why. Doyle is the reason I bid $1 million on Friday night," Garrison said. "And he is the reason we are sitting here now." "Is he?" I couldn't quite bring the sentence to its end. Doyle would be 70 now, near enough my age. Anything could have happened. "He's alive," Garrison said, "living in Florida, retired. He asked me to find you." The relief hit harder than I'd anticipated. Why didn't he come to me himself? "That," Garrison said, "is the longer part of the story, but it begins with a question. Do you remember the spring of 1991? I remembered. Doyle's commercial fishing fleet, 3 boats working out of Cape Cod, was 6 weeks from going under. Every bank in New England had passed on his bridge financing applications. His wife had left. His crew was threatening to walk. He rang me at 2 in the morning from a payphone outside a bar in Provincetown and said, "Walt, I'm drowning." "I remember," I said. "You liquidated diesel equipment from your repair shop," Garrison said, not asking, stating. "Sold a hydraulic lift, 2 diagnostic computers, tools you'd been accumulating for 15 years. Wired $75,000 across state lines on nothing more than a handshake." He had the exact figure, the exact year details I had shared with no one except Norma. "How do you know that?" I asked. "Because Doyle told me," Garrison said. "In 1997, when I acquired his fishing operation, he made me give him one promise, that if I ever had the chance to find you and tell you what had become of that money, I would keep it. He said, you never asked for it back, never raised it again, just handed it over freely and returned to fixing engines as though $75,000 were nothing." "It wasn't nothing," I said. "It was everything I had." "I know," Garrison said. "That's why I'm here." He leaned forward, both hands flat on the white tablecloth, and regarded me with an expression I couldn't easily label, not pity, not admiration, but something closer to respect, weighted with the gravity of a man who is about to tell you something that will rearrange everything. "Did you ever wonder what became of that $75,000, Walter?" The honest answer was no. I had given it freely, expected nothing in return, and gone on building my life without looking back. But the deliberate weight Garrison placed on each word told me he was about to rewrite the arithmetic of my entire existence. He slid a leather folder across the tablecloth. The way a man passes the deed to a property he has been holding in trust for someone who never knew it was theirs. "Your loan saved Doyle's fleet," he said. By 1997, he had grown the operation into something significant. 3 boats became 12. Cape Cod became the whole New England coastline. When I approached him about acquisition, he was the second largest commercial fishing operator in the Northeast. I opened the folder. Legal documents, heavy paper, embossed seals. "He sold to my consortium for $280 million, Garrison went on. "But he set one condition that was not open for discussion. He would not sign unless I permitted him to structure a trust. Irrevocable. 35% equity in the merged Aldrich Maritime Holdings. No buyout provision, no dilution, straight ownership." My eyes found the name on the trust documents. My name, dated April 1997. "You have been the legal owner since the day the documents were executed," Garrison said. "Doyle made me promise 2 things. First, that I would protect that equity as though it were my own. Second, that I would find you and deliver this when the moment was right." When the moment was right, I repeated, my voice arriving in my ears as if from somewhere farther away than my own chest. "He said you would refuse if you knew that you'd treat it as charity and send it back. He wanted you to live your life on your own terms first without the weight of that money altering any of your choices." I turned the pages. Quarterly dividend statements running back 25 years, all deposited into an account I had never touched. Compounding, growing. The final page held a single figure, $95 million. I put the folder down. My hands were entirely steady. "The current valuation is $95 million, Garrison said quietly. "Walter, you are looking at the document that proves you have been a wealthy man for 25 years. I would only learn later what had been unfolding while I sat in that restaurant absorbing numbers that rewrote every version of my life. 3 nights before, on Sunday, June 25th at 11:45 in the evening, my grandson was lying in the back seat of his parents' black SUV in an underground parking garage in Salem. Callum Craddock, 14 years old and frightened, had his iPad tucked beneath a jacket. The rear door was cracked open for air. He was supposed to be asleep. He wasn't. He was recording. Drew's voice came through clean in the concrete acoustics of the garage. "Tonight was a disaster. The old man has a connection we didn't account for." Vivian's reply shed every trace of the polished composure she maintained in public. "The guardianship filing goes through next month regardless. Once he's declared incompetent and moved to the Waverly facility by January, his signature stops mattering. And if this Garrison Aldrich creates complications, he won't. We clear the Rockport property by December, listed in January while Dad's under supervised care. By the time anyone raises an objection, the sale is closed and the assets are positioned offshore." Callum held the iPad perfectly still. His heart was hammering. He did not move, did not breathe any louder than he absolutely had to. The recording app showed 18 minutes of audio. GPS coordinates logged automatically. Timestamp confirmed the date. Callum had been present in that car, a silent witness to every word exchanged around him. Under Massachusetts's one-party consent statute, a participant in a conversation may lawfully record it without informing the other parties. Callum understood 2 things with complete certainty. His parents were planning something terrible, and the only person who could stop them was a priest he had known since his first communion. I sat in the Marblehead restaurant Monday morning while Garrison explained dividend structures and equity growth rates. My coffee had gone cold. Owen appeared soundlessly to refill it. 2. I thanked him without tasting the fresh cup. "Does anyone else know about this?" I asked. "Myself, my attorney. And now you," Garrison said. "Your son doesn't know. Your daughter-in-law doesn't know. I have kept this information sealed for 12 years, waiting for the chance to reach you." While Garrison was speaking 14 miles away in Salem, Callum sat on his bedroom floor staring at his iPad. He had been carrying the recorded conversation for 3 days. Friday night in the garage. Saturday going through the motions at breakfast as though nothing had happened. Sunday lying to his mother when she asked if he seemed off. Monday morning, 9:15 a.m. He opened his email and attached the audio file. The address in the recipient line was one he had committed to memory years before. Father Delacroix at estcrispins.org. Father Bertrand Delacroix, 68 years old with steady eyes and 3 decades at St. Crispin's Parish in Rockport, had baptized Callum at 6 weeks old, given him First Communion at 7, heard his confessions every month for 8 years. Never once breaking confidence, never once passing judgment. Callum typed 3 lines and pressed send before he could think better of it. I don't know who else to go to. I am terrified for my grandfather. Please help." The email left his outbox at 9:17 a.m. Father Delacroix opened it at 9:47 a.m. in his small parish office, a room that smelled of old books and furniture polish. He clicked the attachment. Vivian's voice filled the quiet, cold, methodical, laying out a plan to move a 71-year-old man into a facility so his daughter-in-law could sell off his property. The priest listened through all 18 minutes without shifting in his chair. Then he sat very still for a long while, hands folded on the desk. At last he reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 8 years. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice picked up. "Hello, Walt." "Father Delacroix," the priest said. "I need you to come to the parish as soon as you can manage. There's something here you have to hear." But I was still sitting in the Marblehead restaurant looking at documents that placed my net worth at $95 million when my phone lit up with the priest's name. I wouldn't grasp until later that morning how the two things were connected. The fortune I hadn't known existed, and the grandson I hadn't known was standing guard against the son I thought I understood. Some conversations can only be held between men who know that certain promises outlast the people who made them. I was about to have 2 of those conversations before the day was out. Father Delacroix's call, Monday afternoon, shifted everything. I drove to St. Crispin's, settled into his small office, and listened to 18 minutes of my son and his wife mapping out a plan to move me into a care facility while they stripped my property. When the recording finished, the priest and I sat without speaking for a long time. Then I called Garrison. Garrison Aldrich did not wait to be certain before he moved. 72 years had taught him that certainty was something men in his position rarely got to afford. Tuesday morning, June 13th, he placed a call from his Salem office, and by 9:30 he was seated across from Vince Tully in an unremarkable building 3 blocks from the waterfront. Tully, 55, in a suit that looked like it had never quite recovered from a long trip, had spent 28 years as a private investigator dismantling the financial lies of people who believed they were beyond reach. Garrison slid a folder across the desk. Inside Callum's audio file on a flash drive, a printed dossier on Drew and Vivian, and a handwritten list of questions. "I need to know everything they think a 71-year-old man in Rockport is too worn down to notice," Garrison said. Tully opened the folder and moved through its contents with the practiced speed of someone who had reviewed 10,000 files that looked exactly like this. Budget. No cap. Start with Vivian Craddock. Her professional history, her credentials, every contract she's put her name on in the last 5 years. "How fast can you move?" "Fast," Tully said, already writing. "I've been doing this long enough to know what a life built on paper looks like." I learned all of this afterward, of course. At the time, I was in my Rockport workshop trying to keep my attention on a carburetor rebuild, while my mind kept drifting back to my grandson's voice on that recording. Frightened, protective, more courageous at 14 than any 14-year-old should be required to be. Tully began where all modern investigations begin LinkedIn. Vivian Craddock's profile carried an impressive set of credentials. MBA from the Boston Institute of Strategic Communications class of 2008, undergraduate degree in marketing from Pacific Coast University, professional certifications in nonprofit management and strategic fundraising. She had used those credentials to establish herself as a consultant, advising organizations on donor engagement and corporate partnerships. The Boston Institute of Strategic Communications had the sound of legitimacy, the kind of name that lands well with board members and clients who see no reason to dig deeper. Tully dug deeper. By 2 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, he had completed 17 phone calls. No accreditation body had any record of the institution. The Massachusetts Board of Higher Education held no licensing file for it. The New England Commission of Higher Education had never encountered it. The address printed on Vivian's resume, 471 Hancock Street. Quincy, Massachusetts, turned out to be a UPS store that had opened in 2010, 2 full years after her supposed graduation. Every fraud begins the same way: a single invented line on a resume, a false credential that appears harmless, right up until it becomes the foundation someone constructs an entire life upon. Tully moved on to the undergraduate degree, Pacific Coast University, San Diego, California, class of 2004. The school had existed once briefly in the late 1990s. It had closed in 1997 after losing its accreditation 7 years before Vivian claimed it had handed her a diploma. She had not simply lied about a degree. She had chosen a defunct institution that could not contradict her from an era when the records might plausibly be hard to locate. By Friday, June 16th, Tully had assembled a complete timeline. His preliminary report arrived that afternoon by encrypted email. I read it at my kitchen table twice, then a third time because the full dimensions of what she had built required more than one pass to take in. Vivian had constructed her professional identity entirely from components that did not exist. The MBA from the Invented Institute, the undergraduate degree from the shuttered university marketing certifications issued by programs that had never credentialed a single person. And she had used these fabrications to execute contracts on behalf of my son's nonprofit. The precision of the architecture told Tully what he needed to know. This wasn't desperation, it was design. The Atlantic Insurance Group contract drew his closest attention. March 2021, a corporate sponsorship agreement worth $320,000 over 2 years. Vivian had signed as Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Coastal Conservation Alliance, representing herself as the holder of an MBA in Strategic Communications and 8 years of experience in nonprofit development. Every word of it was fiction. Under federal law, the timeline was significant. Wire fraud and mail fraud carried 5-year statutes of limitations under 18 U.S.C. Section 3282. The Atlantic Insurance contract was 16 months old, well within the statute fully actionable. Massachusetts's own charitable fraud statutes provided additional grounds under state jurisdiction. Tully documented everything with the care of someone who understood his work would eventually be examined by attorneys and possibly by judges' bank records, email correspondence, signed agreements bearing Vivian's fabricated credentials. Each piece added weight to a case that was growing too substantial to explain away as coincidence or honest error. Tuesday night, June 20th. My kitchen phone rang at 11:47. I'd been at the table for hours, cold coffee, no sleep, my thoughts circling back to Callum lying still in that SUV while his parents mapped out my future. Mr. Craddock. Tully's voice was level, unhurried. This is Vince Tully. Garrison Aldrich retained me to look into your daughter-in-law. I know, I said. I've seen the preliminary report. Then you've seen what I found, but I need you to hear it plainly without any room for ambiguity. He paused. Her credentials aren't real. None of them. Not the MBA, not the undergraduate degree, not the certifications that appear on every professional document she's ever filed. She assembled her entire professional identity from institutions that don't exist and degrees she never earned. I set the coffee cup down without a sound. How far back? At least 2013, possibly further. Every contract she's signed in the nonprofit sector, every board she's advised, every client relationship she's built, all of it is resting on a foundation of systematic fraud. And my son, that Tully said, is what I'm investigating next. I sat alone in my kitchen past midnight after he rang off. My daughter-in-law had built her entire professional life out of schools that never produced a single graduate and degrees that existed only in documents she had created herself. The woman who wanted to have me declared incompetent had spent a decade being someone she was not. And if she had lied about all of that, what else had she invented? Vince answered my question about what else Vivian had invented by doing what he did best, following the money. The pattern leapt off the page at line 37 of the third sheet, a 7-figure expenditure in the Coastal Conservation Alliance's 2021 IRS filing labeled simply as consulting services. July 5, 2022 was a Wednesday. Vince sat in his Salem office working through 3 years of Form 990 filings for my son's nonprofit. Tax returns are public record. Anyone can pull them. Most people never do. Vince had built his career on being the one who did. A Delaware-registered entity called LF Consulting LLC turned up consistently in the operational expenditure section, $412,000 in 2019, $690,000 in 2020, $947,000 in 2021. The figures climbed every year, representing 68% of total donations received. No other consulting firm appeared across those 3 filings, no competing bids, no alternate vendors, just LF. Consulting absorbing the majority of every dollar good people had given to protect Massachusetts's coastline. This isn't consulting, Vince said into his phone at 5:30 that Wednesday afternoon. Garrison was on the other end. This is a pipeline. He traced the company through Delaware Secretary of State records. LF Consulting LLC had been formed in March 2019 through a nominee service, one of those legal arrangements that buries beneficial ownership beneath layers of corporate paperwork. The kind of structure legitimate companies use for privacy, the kind illegitimate ones use for concealment. The initials fit perfectly. LF, Walter Craddock. If state or federal investigators ever began pulling on the nonprofit's suspicious transfer patterns, the corporate trail would dead end at a 71-year-old fisherman in Rockport who had never registered a business in his life. They put his initials on the door. If the IRS digs, Vince told Garrison, the paper trail stops at a man who doesn't know it exists. That's deliberate. This wasn't sloppiness. This was architecture. The frame had been constructed with patience. 3 years of tax filings, each one laying down another coat of false legitimacy over a structure built to collapse on a single man. By Friday morning, Vince had finished the full forensic accounting. I would look at those spreadsheets later, rows and columns that rendered human generosity as mathematical theft. Of every dollar donated to the Coastal Conservation Alliance between 2019 and 2022, only 18 cents reached actual conservation work, 18 cents to acquire endangered wetland parcels, 18 cents to run beach cleanup programs, 18 cents to produce school materials. The remaining 82 cents flowed into LF Consulting's Delaware accounts, and from there into wire transfers Vince was still untangling. He found luxury hotel charges in Boston and New York, first-class airfare to conferences that showed up nowhere on the nonprofit's public calendar, a $48,000 purchase from a jewelry retailer in Boston that Vince doubted had anything to do with coastal marsh restoration, $2.4 million across 3 years. Every donor who'd written a check to protect a tidal ecosystem had unknowingly helped fund the construction of a cage with my name welded to the door. Garrison drove to Rockport Saturday morning to deliver the findings face-to-face. Some conversations cannot happen over a phone or through encrypted email. Some revelations require one man to look another in the eye while explaining how completely his family has betrayed him. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Norma had served breakfast for 30 years, the same table where I'd had my coffee the morning Drew called to invite me to that gala. Garrison spread Delaware corporate filings and tax documents across the worn surface. "They put your initials on their theft, Walter," he said without any preamble. LF Consulting Walter Craddock, the shell company that processed $2.4 million in diverted nonprofit funds, is registered under your exact initials. I picked up one of the pages. The Delaware registration showed a formation date of March 2019, 3 months into the fraud's first year. The nominee service shields whoever really owns it, Garrison went on. But if this unraveled before they moved you into that Waverly facility, if the IRS or the Attorney General started tracing the suspicious transfers, where would the forensics point? I understood at once. To me. A man who suddenly had access to $95 million in equity, who coincidentally operates a consulting company bearing his own initials that happens to process the bulk of his son's nonprofit donations. The math would look damning. The optics would be devastating. I would wear the handcuffs, I said. You would wear the handcuffs, Garrison agreed. While they walked away with the money and everyone who'd ever trusted you assumed you were exactly what your son made you look like at that gala, a greedy old man who couldn't stop himself from stealing from coastal conservation. I set the document down and looked out the kitchen window toward the harbor. The morning sun caught the water the way it always had. Boats moved in and out on the tide, indifferent to the conspiracy being taken apart at my kitchen table. She built this over 3 years, I said. 3 years of patience. 3 years of tax filings that would serve as evidence against you. She didn't simply plan to steal the money and warehouse you in a care facility, Walter. She built the entire scheme to detonate in your face the moment anyone looked too closely. The shell company, the initials, the nominee service, the amounts growing year by year, suggesting the mounting boldness of someone who believed he'd gotten away with it. Every piece designed to make a 71-year-old fisherman look like a criminal mastermind running a multi-year fraud behind the face of his son's environmental nonprofit. But she made one critical miscalculation, Garrison said, gathering the documents back into his folder. I looked at him. What's that? She assumed you'd be alone when the walls came down. She didn't account for a college roommate who spent 25 years trying to repay a debt. She didn't account for a 14-year-old boy with the nerve to record his parents in a parking garage. And she certainly didn't account for a billionaire who takes loyalty seriously enough to hire the best investigator in New England. I sat at that kitchen table a long while after Garrison left, staring at the photocopy he'd placed in front of me. My initials on a shell company I'd never heard of. My name on a fraud I'd never committed. My daughter-in-law's elegant handwriting on documents that would have destroyed me. She had not built the frame alone. She had purchased help. The $15,000 cash withdrawal from Vivian Craddock's personal checking account on March 8, 2022, had no matching business expense anywhere in the nonprofit's books. Vince caught it on Monday, July 10th, while working through her personal banking records obtained via Garrison's legal team. The amount was notable. The timing was precise. The absence of any paper trail beyond the withdrawal slip pointed towards something Vivian had not wanted documented. He went further back and turned up a second withdrawal from earlier that month, $500 cash, March 3rd, small enough to read as routine. Both withdrawals followed calendar entries labeled only as medical consultation. Vince cross-referenced professional directories and identified two Salem psychiatrists who specialized in geriatric cognitive assessment, Dr. Irene Ashmore, with a practice on Congress Street, and Dr. Stuart Millbrook, operating out of Peabody. She was shopping for a signature, Vince told Garrison over the phone Tuesday afternoon. The Massachusetts Board of Licensure in Medicine keeps records of ethics complaints. They're not always public, but they're always reachable with the right legal pressure. Vince found Dr. Ashmore's filing Tuesday morning. Dr. Irene Ashmore, a Salem psychiatrist with 18 years of unblemished practice, had filed a complaint on March 5th, 2 days after Vivian's first appointment. The report stated that a woman who identified herself as Vivian Craddock had requested a psychiatric evaluation of her elderly father-in-law for adult guardianship proceedings. The woman had offered cash for an expedited affidavit certifying cognitive decline. Dr. Ashmore had ended the consultation after 12 minutes, shown Vivian the door, turned down the $500, and immediately reported the solicitation to the medical board as attempted guardianship fraud. Dr. Ashmore had recognized the request for exactly what it was in 12 minutes and walked away. That kind of integrity has grown rare enough to seem remarkable. Vivian had needed a different kind of doctor. Dr. Stuart Millbrook's professional record told Vince everything he needed before he placed a single call. 3 ethics complaints in 7 years, improper billing in 2016, failure to maintain adequate patient records in 2018, prescribing controlled substances without proper examination in 2020. Millbrook ran a private practice in Peabody with minimal oversight, the kind of marginal operation that survives on patients who can't access better care or on doctors who can't practice anywhere more reputable. The $15,000 cash payment on March 8th corresponded exactly to a signed affidavit included in Vivian's guardianship filing package. Vince got hold of the probate court documents Wednesday morning. The affidavit was dated March 7th. Dr. Stuart Millbrook, running a marginal Peabody practice with 3 prior ethics complaints on his record, had certified that I suffered from advanced cognitive decline, onset dementia, and an inability to manage my financial affairs. He recommended immediate supervised care, $15,000. The price someone will accept to put his name on a declaration that a man who rebuilds diesel engines for a living cannot understand basic financial transactions. Millbrook had never examined me, never called my phone, never set foot in my workshop, never exchanged a single word with me in his life. Yet he had signed a medical document declaring me incompetent based on an examination that existed nowhere except in Vivian's imagination and his own willingness to commit fraud for cash. Vince drove to Rockport Thursday evening and found me in the workshop. I'd been expecting him. Garrison had called that afternoon to say Vince had turned up something I needed to see face to face. We settled at my kitchen table, the same one where Garrison had laid out the shell company papers, the same one where I'd read Vince's preliminary report on Vivian's fabricated credentials. That table was becoming a courtroom for the evidence of my family's systematic betrayal. Vince set down 2 documents, a bank statement showing the $15,000 withdrawal and a photocopy of Dr. Millbrook's affidavit. I read it carefully. Translated out of the medical language, it meant one thing. My daughter-in-law had paid a corrupt psychiatrist to declare me incompetent so she could park me in a care facility and take everything I owned. This is the affidavit she bought, Vince said. Severe memory impairment, disorientation, financial incompetence. Everything a probate court needs to approve emergency guardianship. The examination date is March 7th, I said, reading the header. Were you in Peabody that Tuesday? I looked up at him. I was here in my shop rebuilding a transmission for a fishing trawler out of Gloucester. Worked from 7 in the morning until well after dark. The owner picked it up Wednesday. I have the receipt. Then Dr. Millbrook certified you as incompetent without ever meeting you. He paused. How much trouble is he in medically? His license should be revoked. Criminally fraud conspiracy. Possibly more, depending on how the Attorney General wants to charge it. Vince tapped the affidavit. But the immediate question is what this means for you. She filed this with the probate court 4 months ago. The guardianship petition is active. I held the document and read it through a second time. Dr. Millbrook's signature certifying my cognitive decline based on an examination that had never taken place. My daughter-in-law had paid $15,000 to a doctor with 3 ethics violations to declare me incompetent on a Tuesday when I was alone in my workshop doing the precise mechanical work I had done for 50 years. She had purchased the legal right to warehouse me and strip away my property with a forged medical document. The affidavit gave her everything she needed, a licensed psychiatrist's certification of my incompetence, medical justification for removing me from my home, legal grounds to appoint herself and my son as guardians with full authority over my finances and property. And she had filed it in March 4 months ago while I was fixing engines and drinking coffee before dawn, completely unaware that a stranger in Peabody had signed away my autonomy for cash. "When's the hearing?" I asked. Vince pulled another document from his folder. "August 14th, 5 weeks from now." She scheduled the guardianship hearing for August 14th. 5 weeks became 5 months when Vince corrected the timeline. The hearing wasn't August 14th, it was December 15th. Vivian had built in buffer time room to maneuver if complications surfaced. That miscalculation gave me something more valuable than she'd intended. Time to think. Saturday morning, July 22nd. Garrison and Vince arrived at my house carrying 3 leather folders and the methodical patience of men who understood that complex problems require careful presentation. They spread the evidence across my kitchen table the way surgeons arrange instruments before an operation. Each piece placed with precision, nothing concealed, nothing softened. The fabricated credentials dating back to 2008. The shell company established March 2019. Financial records showing $2.4 million diverted over 3 years, 68% of every donated dollar. The false psychiatric affidavit purchased in March. The guardianship petition filed with Cumberland County Probate Court on April 12th. The hearing set for December 15th. Every element connected to the next like gears in a machine built to dismantle one man's life. "They built this over 18 months, Garrison said, his finger tracing a timeline he'd sketched on legal paper. Every piece timed, every document layered on the one before. Credentials to shell company to medical fraud. It's not a scheme, Walter. It's a system." I turned the pages slowly, reading the highlighted sections with a mechanic's precision. Bank statements, tax filings, corporate registrations, medical certifications. Each document told part of a story that made terrible sense once assembled in sequence. The fabricated MBA gave Vivian the credibility to sign nonprofit contracts. The contracts created cash flow. The shell company bearing my initials diverted that cash flow while building a case against me. The false medical affidavit provided legal justification to remove me from my home. The guardianship petition activated the mechanism to execute everything at once. It was elegant the way well-designed machines are elegant. Every component serving more than one purpose. No wasted motion, nothing left to chance. 40 minutes passed in near silence, broken only by the turn of pages and the distant sound of boats moving through Rockport Harbor. I had spent 50 years repairing engines other men had written off as unsalvageable. This was simply another machine that needed systematic disassembly, one bolt at a time. Finally, I looked up at Garrison and Vince and asked the question they'd been waiting for. "My son, how much of this is his ink? How much belongs to Derek?" Vince opened a separate folder. He signed the guardianship petition on April 10th, 2 days before it was filed. He approved the Rockport property liquidation plan in writing on March 15th. He authorized every LF consulting contract between 2019 and 2022 as executive director of the nonprofit. He paused. But the architecture, the shell company structure, the Delaware registration, the false medical affidavit, the offshore account setup, those bear only Vivian's fingerprints. The emails, the cash withdrawals, the meetings with Dr. Millbrook, all her. "He followed her plan," I said. "He followed her plan," Garrison agreed. "Whether he understood what he was following is the question we can't answer yet. He may have believed the shell company was legitimate consulting. He may have accepted her credentials without ever checking them. Or he may have known exactly what he was signing." I set down the guardianship petition and looked at my son's signature. The same handwriting I had seen on birthday cards and college applications and his wedding license. The same name I had given him 39 years ago in a hospital room in Salem while Norma held him and told me he had my eyes. "We need to move carefully," Vince said. "The hearing is real. If we don't present counter-evidence, a probate judge could rule in Vivian's favor on the strength of Dr. Millbrook's affidavit alone." "I understand the risk," I said, "but I have terms." Garrison leaned back. "We're listening." "First, Callum is 14 years old. He recorded his parents out of love and fear, not strategy. He doesn't learn the full measure of this conspiracy until he turns 18. Those are my terms. He deserves 4 more years of childhood before he understands exactly how deep his mother's betrayal runs." "Agreed," Garrison said without hesitation. "Second, we wait for the right moment, not the fast one. I've spent 71 years being patient. I can wait until December 15th if that's when the pieces line up correctly." Vince made a note. The hearing gives us a natural deadline. Third, no press until after. I will not have my grandson reading about his father in the newspapers while he's still in high school. When this becomes public, it becomes public on my timeline. Protecting Callum was not negotiable, not tactical. It was the load-bearing wall of everything that followed, and I would sooner see my own house come down than let that boy carry this truth before his time. Garrison gathered the documents and returned them to their folders with the same careful precision he'd used laying them out. You understand what you're proposing: 5 months of preparation while they believe they're still operating undetected. 5 months where Vivian assumes her guardianship petition will go unopposed. That's a significant risk. I stood and crossed to the window overlooking the harbor. The morning sun caught the water the way it always did. Boats moved on the tide according to laws older than any human scheme. How long did they spend building this? I asked. 18 months, Vince said, from the initial planning through the guardianship filing. 18 months of construction, fabricated credentials, shell companies, false medical records, legal filings. Every piece placed deliberately, every timeline calculated to deliver maximum damage with minimum warning. I turned from the window and looked at Garrison and Vince sitting at my kitchen table. I have 5 months to dismantle what took them 18 months to build, I said. That's enough time. Garrison and Vince exchanged a look across the table. They had come expecting to find a man who needed rescuing. What they'd found instead was a 71-year-old mechanic who knew that every complex machine operates in sequence. Identify the right component, pull it first, and the whole structure falls open in your hands. Then we construct the counter case, Garrison said. Piece by piece, without fanfare, every scrap of evidence cataloged and verified. When December 15th gets here, we're not mounting a defense, we're performing a demolition. I drew the timeline across the table toward me and sat back down. 5 months to the hearing. 5 months to shield my grandson, to lay bare what my daughter-in-law had done, and to settle in my own mind what my son was owed, if anything at all. The first piece had already begun to move, and that first piece turned out to be a woman I'd never crossed paths with, holding evidence I didn't know was out there. Lorinda Faber had kept that silver USB drive in her handbag for 237 consecutive days, which meant she'd told herself 237 times that she was still biding her time, still waiting on the right moment. I pieced her story together afterward, once everything broke open in ways none of us had foreseen. But sequence is everything, so I'll lay it out the way Garrison walked me through it, the same way Lorinda would eventually tell it herself on the record under oath. Lorinda Faber, 45, shouldering 8 months' worth of evidence tucked inside a silver USB drive, had been aware of the dual ledgers since February. But her daughter needed to cross a graduation stage before Lorinda could afford the cost of coming forward. February 2022. Vivian had handed Lorinda amended tax filings to prepare for the Coastal Conservation Alliance. On its face, nothing remarkable. Nonprofits refile returns all the time. But Vivian gave her 2 entirely different sets of figures. One version, dressed up for IRS review, showed conservation expenditures. The other told the true story: wire transfers flowing into LF Consulting LLC. Lorinda copied everything onto the silver USB drive that same day. Each morning she refreshed it with the latest transactions. Each evening she tucked it back into her handbag and reassured herself that she was building a record, not enabling a crime. There was a distinction there. She had to believe there was. Her daughter Lacey was a junior at the University of Massachusetts, $58,000 a year, 9 months remaining before the May ceremony. Lorinda was pulling in $47,000 as the nonprofit's chief accountant. Walking away before Lacey finished wasn't an option. Triggering retaliation before her daughter had that diploma wasn't something she could risk. Morning after morning, she put her daughter's future ahead of donors she'd never meet. Night after night, she told herself that standing by the one person she loved justified leaving thousands of strangers undefended. While Lorinda made that choice day after day through spring and into summer, Audra Holcomb was assembling something from a different angle entirely. Audra Holcomb, 38, on the investigative desk at the Salem Press. Audra had started pulling on the Coastal Conservation Alliance thread back in February, after a donor reported that a marsh restoration project had never happened despite funds being confirmed received. Over 8 months, she methodically reviewed public IRS Form 99, filing stacking claimed conservation expenditures against actual land purchases and remediation permits on file with the state. The arithmetic made its own case, no inside source required. 68% to consulting services, 14% to overhead and administration. 18 cents out of every donated dollar arriving at genuine conservation work. Audra had positioned herself 3 tables away from me at that June gala for one purpose: to watch how the Foundation's principals conducted themselves. I had no idea. As far as I was concerned, she was one more attendee moving her finger across a screen. In reality, she was recording everything she saw. Her finished piece ran under the headline, "Only 18 cents where coastal conservation dollars actually go," 300 column inches, accounting tables included. Not one figure sourced from a leak. No anonymous informants. No one on the inside talking. Pure forensic document work carried with the confidence of a writer who understood that solid facts require nothing added to them. The piece hit Thursday morning, October 19th. Lorinda caught it at her kitchen counter at 6:47. Her coffee cup stopped moving halfway to her lips. The headline ran across the top of the front page in letters big enough to see from the far end of the room. Every number Audra had pulled from public records lined up precisely with the private ledger Lorinda had been carrying for 237 days. The load she'd been holding for 8 months eased between one breath and the next, not lifted entirely but spread across something wider and sturdier than her alone. A journalist had cracked the fraud using nothing but IRS documents. The Attorney General had access to those same documents. The exposure was rolling in regardless of what Lorinda decided. May graduation no longer mattered. She stood there looking at the silver USB drive next to the newspaper on her counter. A few weeks back, a corporate attorney by the name of Aaron Glenwood had slipped her his card at a nonprofit compliance seminar in Salem. He was part of Garrison Aldrich's effort. He'd talked to her for exactly 4 minutes about the protections available to whistleblowers under Massachusetts law, then suggested in measured terms that she might one day find herself needing them. She'd understood the message Garrison was assembling, something they knew she was sitting on evidence, and they were giving her the chance to decide whether she'd step forward or go quiet. At 7:03 Thursday morning, Lorinda picked up the phone and dialed Aaron Glenwood's direct number before her nerve could fail her. Second ring, he picked up. His tone held the steadiness of a man who'd spent the night expecting exactly this call at almost exactly this hour. Glenwood. Mr. Glenwood, my name is Lorinda Faber. I'm the chief accountant over at Coastal Conservation Alliance. Good morning, Miss Faber. I have what you need. Full duplicate ledgers, going all the way back to February. Every transaction, every transfer, every line item on the public filings that was falsified. 3 seconds passed on the line. Are you somewhere private right now? Home, kitchen, no one else here. Is the evidence on you? Silver USB drive. I've had it on me every single day since February 7th. Then be at my office at 9 o'clock this morning. Bring the drive and nothing else. No files, no paper, no notes. Just the drive. Understood. Understood. Miss Faber, one thing before you go. You are fully covered under Massachusetts whistleblower statutes. The step you're taking demands real courage, and the law will honor that courage with complete protection. Your position is safe. No one can come after you. Are we clear on that? We're clear. Then I'll have the door open at 9. Lorinda put the phone down and turned her eyes back to the USB drive. 237 days of recorded truth. 8 months of shadow bookkeeping that tracked every dollar routed into the shell company bearing my initials. Each falsified charge, each redirected donation, each deception, Vivian had served up to the IRS, to the donors, to the state of Massachusetts. By 9:47 that morning, Garrison would hold the documentation needed to show not that Lorinda Faber had taken part in the fraud, but that she had been its most thorough witness. And by 10:15, the legal operation would stop being an investigation and become a prosecution. Meanwhile, I was in my workshop that Thursday morning with a fuel injector in my hands, completely in the dark. The second component of our counter-operation had switched itself on 100 miles to the south, and I didn't know it yet. I wouldn't hear about Lorinda's call until Friday afternoon when Garrison made the drive up to Rockport carrying news that rewrote our schedule. We'd built everything around December 15th. The whistleblower just shaved 6 weeks off that plan. Garrison reached me by phone Friday afternoon. 4 words. We have everything. When Lorinda Faber set the silver USB drive on the conference table, it made a faint metallic tap-hard case against glass surface. 8 months of hidden evidence touching down on solid legal ground at last. She sat inside a 14th floor Salem conference room alongside Aaron Glenwood, Vince Tully, and Garrison. Harbor light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the far wall. The drive rested at the center of the table like a compact silver projectile that had been in flight since February and had now finally reached what it was always aimed at. Aaron opened the drive at 9:05. Dual ledgers complete and intact. Every wire transfer into LF Consulting, LLC routing numbers, timestamps, all of it. Public Form 990 filings laid directly beside the real expenditure records. Discrepancies tallied to the cent. Private email correspondence between Vivian and offshore banking contacts. Lorinda hadn't only kept the evidence safe. Working alone day after day, she had assembled a prosecution-ready case. The dual ledgers are pristine, Tully said, eyes on the screen. We're not talking about a witness account. This is arithmetic. Numbers don't lie. Garrison looked across the table at Lorinda. You didn't merely preserve what you found, Miss Faber. You constructed the case itself. For the first time in 8 months, Lorinda Faber let her breath go all the way out. Aaron walked her through Massachusetts's Whistleblower Protection Act over the next 20 minutes. Her exposure was zero across every dimension, no wrongful termination risk, no civil liability, no criminal standing as an accessory. Surrendering the drive had moved her cleanly from potential witness to protected informant under both state and federal statute. You did nothing wrong, Aaron told her. You did everything right. At 9:45, Garrison asked the question that mattered most. Was there enough here to take to the Attorney General today? Aaron went through it piece by piece. Wire fraud, mail fraud, charitable fraud under Massachusetts nonprofit law, conspiracy, a credible basis for money laundering charges, stacked alongside Audra Holcomb's published expose and Tully's work on the fabricated medical affidavit they had probable cause to spare. We could walk this over this afternoon, Aaron said. The AG's investigators could be on site at the nonprofit's offices first thing Monday. Garrison pushed back from the table and crossed to the windows that looked out over Salem Harbor. A long silence settled in the room. Then, without turning around, when does the guardianship hearing convene? December 15th, 8 weeks out. Garrison came around slowly from the glass, and when the words came, each one landed with the weight of a decision already made. We file with the AG after Thanksgiving. But before that filing goes in, I put something in front of someone, an invitation my son has spent 3 years trying to find. A pitch meeting at Aldrich Maritime Holdings. Tully grasped it at once. He'll arrive convinced he's finally got what he's been after. He'll bring his board, his wife, his polished presentation, Garrison said. He'll walk in thinking he's closing the deal that proves his whole career meant something. And instead he'll find his father seated at that table, the man he tried to frame, the man he tried to have put away, the man who has held 35% of this company since 1997. The room went quiet. I want him to walk in on his own 2 feet, Garrison said, and his voice was almost gentle. Certain he's already won. That's the moment the truth lands with the most force. When Garrison reached me that Friday afternoon and laid out his reasoning, it made complete sense to me. My son didn't require handcuffs. What he needed was to look at me without the protective story he'd been telling himself, the one where I was helpless. Not a man pulled from the wreckage by attorneys and investigators, but the architect of his own undoing, the man he'd miscalculated for 39 years, sitting quietly at the head of the table where he'd expected to collect his prize. Justice delivered as arrest leaves a man hardened. Justice delivered as revelation leaves a man cracked open to something new. Garrison was building the second kind. 6 weeks to the boardroom, time enough to get ready, and time enough to see what the scheme had done to the people closest to me. I could read everything in Callum's posture before his bicycle even reached me. Saturday afternoon, November 4th. I was working a brush along the fence boards when I caught the sound of gravel shifting under tires. Callum coasted down the drive, let the bike fall without saying anything, and lowered himself heavily onto the porch steps. He stared down at his sneakers as though they held an answer. I put the paintbrush down and settled beside him. Said nothing, just held the silence the way you hold a cold ignition patient and still giving it room to catch. Can I stay here a while? He finally got out. Long as you want, son. 15 minutes went by. Gulls worked their way across the harbor. Callum pulled at a loose thread on the knee of his jeans, winding it around his finger until the tip whitened, then releasing it and starting the same loop again. His voice, when it came, was barely above a breath. Grandpa, did I do something terrible? He kept looking at his shoes. I recorded them. Mom and Dad in the car after that big dinner in June, the one where everyone was dressed up and you had Grandma's coat on. He lifted his eyes and they were red. I was in the back seat. They figured I was asleep, but I heard what they were saying about putting you somewhere, getting rid of your house. It felt wrong, so I got my iPad under my jacket and recorded it. Then I sent it to Father Delacroix because I couldn't think of anyone else. His voice broke on the last word. Is Dad going to lose everything because of me? A 14-year-old boy bearing the load of keeping his grandfather safe from two parents who should have been keeping him safe. The shape of that reversal was almost too much to sit with. I got down on my knees on the cold gravel and put my face level with his. You did nothing wrong, Callum. What you did is exactly what a boy with a decent heart does when something frightens him. Your father is going to be all right. Men who are smart enough can learn to set things straight once somebody makes them look clearly at what they've done. Are you handling it, Grandpa? I am, I told him. And I give you my word, you're not the one who did something terrible. You're the one who did something brave. His shoulders came up a little, not all the way, but enough. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, got to his feet and picked up the bicycle. Then he paused and looked back at me. I love you, Grandpa. Those 4 words went through me harder than anything Drew had thrown at that gala. Harder than any document Tully had spread across my kitchen table. I love you too, Callum. He pedaled away and was swallowed up where the maples arched over the lane. I watched until he was gone. Then I reached for the paintbrush, but my hand wasn't steady. I'd just given my grandson a promise that everything would come right while keeping from him the full weight of what that meant, that his father was staring down the possibility of prison, and his mother had spent a year constructing a criminal architecture around our family. I'd told him his father was learning to correct his mistakes when the truth was, I was about to make my son reckon with every single one of them in the most unsparing way I knew how. But Callum didn't need that truth. Not at 14, not while he was still working through algebra problems and trusting that the grown-ups in his life were solid ground. What he needed was a grandfather who stood straight, who kept his word, who held the ugliness of adult failure at bay for as long as he was able. I intended to stand. 6 weeks to the boardroom. Somewhere in Salem, my son had no idea the meeting he'd been hunting for 3 years was about to become the most consequential and most punishing conversation of his life. But first, I had a fence to finish. Some work you do because it needs doing. Some work you do because your hands need somewhere honest to be while your mind is carrying something too heavy to set down. While I was painting and keeping the truth from Callum Garrison, was fitting the final piece of his design into place. The email landed in my son's inbox at 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I got the details later from Garrison, who described what had happened with the quiet pleasure of someone watching a chess opponent advance exactly as expected. My son opened the message from Andrew Sterling Jr., an associate at Aldrich Maritime Holdings, already bracing himself for the courteous rejection he'd collected 46 times before. What he read instead was an invitation to present directly to the investment committee. Friday, December 15th, 22nd floor, 9:30 sharp. He read it 3 times. This cannot be real, he said out loud to an empty room. 3 years. It cannot actually be real. But the letterhead was right. The email domain checked out. The particulars were far too precise to be generated automatically. 47 emails sent to Aldrich contacts since 2019. 14 phone calls that never made it past the receptionist. 6 letters sent by post that drew only automated replies. 36 consecutive months of closed doors until this Tuesday when one opened on its own. What my son did not know was that every word in that invitation had been composed at the direction of a 72-year-old man who understood that the most effective trap is one the target steps into of his own free will. My son hit reply with fingers that were not quite steady, confirmed he'd be there, offered his thanks in appropriately professional language, and sent it at 2:53 p.m., 6 minutes after it arrived. Then he called Vivian. Aldrich Maritime Holdings, he told her, when she picked up. December 15th, they're giving us the meeting. Her response was measured. Don't start counting before the ink is on the paper. I know exactly what they need to hear. I've had 3 years to get this pitch right. It's where it needs to be. Just move carefully. Those people didn't build what they've built by being simple. I'm not after simple, I'm after the door, and they just opened it. What my son heard in her voice was worry about how he'd perform. What Vivian was actually feeling was the first cold draft of recognition that the world they'd so carefully assembled had started coming apart in places she couldn't reach. Audra Holcomb's article had published 3 weeks prior. Lorinda Faber had stopped showing up to the office. Small fissures, spreading. But my son saw none of it. He saw only the open door. That night at 10:30, he stood in his bedroom closet choosing what he'd wear to the most important pitch of his career. He was selecting a suit for his coronation with no knowledge he was dressing for his reckoning. Charcoal gray wool, custom tailored. It had cost more than his first car. He hung it on the back of the bedroom door where it would be the first thing he saw each morning for the next 31 days. Vivian watched from the doorway with a look that lived somewhere between unease and surrender. The expression of someone who can feel the hull taking on water and knows the captain won't alter course. "It's only a pitch meeting," she said quietly. "Don't make it bigger than it is." He turned toward her, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. 3 years I've been after this. December 15th changes everything. She held her eyes on him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. My son looked back at the charcoal gray suit hanging against the white door. He could already see himself stepping out of the elevator onto the 22nd floor, the canvas duffel bag worn soft at the handles in his grip. Every slide honed through 3 years of rejection into something precise enough to cut through anything. He did not know his father would be sitting at that table. He did not know that the man who had arranged the invitation had watched him auction off a dinner with that same father for a single dollar in front of 250 people. What comes next is the moment I had been moving toward for 38 years. Not a confrontation, something quieter and far more permanent than that. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If someone you had always protected in silence was on the verge of destroying themselves, would you step in and stop them, or would you let them reach the end of that road on their own? He did not know that Garrison Aldrich's interest in his nonprofit had nothing to do with coastal conservation and everything to do with showing a 39-year-old man the true cost of mistaking his father's patience for helplessness. He went to sleep that night believing he'd finally arrived. 31 days later, he would learn exactly how wrong a man can be about everything. I recognized Doyle Cavett before he recognized me, which bought me about 5 seconds to decide whether 43 years of silence was something that could be settled in a single moment. He came through the arrivals gate at Boston Logan International Airport carrying a canvas duffel bag worn soft at the handles, moving with the deliberate gait of a man whose knees had absorbed too many years on hard ground. His hair had gone entirely white. The last time I'd laid eyes on Doyle Cavett was August 1979, when we both still had dark hair and the unearned confidence of men who thought friendship was something that couldn't be broken. He spotted me and stopped mid-stride. We stood there for a moment without moving. Then Doyle covered the distance between us and pulled me into an embrace that carried the smell of airport coffee and old leather and something I couldn't quite identify until it came to me it was forgiveness. "Walter," he said. "God, it's good to see your face. You look old," I told him, because it was true and because some friendships run deep enough that honesty doesn't need to be cushioned. "You look like hell yourself," Doyle said. He stepped back and looked me over with the frank eye of someone who'd earned the privilege. "When Garrison rang me, he said you were in trouble. He didn't mention you'd been carrying it alone." "I wasn't alone," I said. "I had Norma." Doyle repeated her name quietly. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when she passed. For any of it." We headed north on Route 1 with the December coast running gray and cold outside my window. Doyle had arranged a rental at the airport, but I'd insisted on my own truck. My road's my right to fill the silence or leave it alone as I saw fit. The first 20 minutes passed without a word between us. Then Doyle said, "June 2000, Norma called me out of nowhere. I was down in Tampa running a marine supply operation. Hadn't heard from either of you since your wedding back in '79. She told me she needed to share something, and she needed my word I'd hold it until the moment was right. I kept my eyes on the road. She told me about the $75,000, Doyle went on, about Garrison Aldrich and the equity position and the $95 million you didn't know you were sitting on. She said you'd just found out and intended to stay quiet about it because you didn't want it reshaping your life or warping Drew's character. She said she was with you on that, but she wanted somebody outside the family in the picture. Someone who could move if things ever went sideways." The thing she said hit me square at the junction of Route 1 and Pond Road. Norma had known for 22 years and had never once breathed a word suggesting I was wrong to keep it buried. "Why you?" I asked. Doyle smiled. "Because I walked away from our friendship over a disagreement about money. You wanted to co-sign a loan for your cousin's fishing boat. I told you it was a bad bet. We both said things we didn't mean, and instead of acting like grown men and apologizing, we just let the phone go quiet. Norma said, anyone foolish enough to throw away a best friend over $5,000 would understand perfectly well why you were afraid of what $95 million might do to the people you loved." I pulled off into the lot of a shuttered seasonal restaurant and cut the engine. "She was sick for 2 years before she went," I said. "Never once complained, never asked why it had to be her. Just kept making certain I knew where she'd filed the insurance papers, which hymns she'd chosen for the service, whether I remembered to pull the turkey out the night before Thanksgiving and not the morning of." "She reached me again in February 2021, Doyle said quietly. 3 months before she died. She told me the time was getting close and she had something she needed me to hold until she was sure you'd have use for it. He reached into the canvas duffel bag and produced 2 envelopes, both cream-colored stationery, both sealed in Norma's careful hand. One bore my name and her script. The other said Drew and nothing more. She told me to watch, Doyle said. She said, if Drew ever moved against you, money, freedom, dignity, any of it, you'd know when the moment came. Garrison called me 3 days ago and told me about the guardianship petition, the shell company, the fabricated medical affidavit. He said December 15th was the reckoning and Norma would have wanted me in the room. I took the envelope with my name and turned it over slowly. The paper was thick and fine, the kind Norma reserved for thank you notes and sympathy cards, and the letter she'd left on my pillow the morning I found her in the garden already gone. She knew, I said. The words didn't come out cleanly. She knew all of it from the very start. Doyle reached across and put his hand on my shoulder. She knew you, Walter. That's what she knew. And she trusted you'd do right when the time arrived, even if it cost you. I didn't open the envelope. Not there. I sat in my truck in that empty lot with my oldest friend at my side and my dead wife's last words in my grip, and I understood that Norma had been building this safety net around me since 2000, laying out a structure of protection piece by piece across the years because she had read our son more clearly than either of us ever wanted to admit. My phone buzzed. A message from Garrison board meeting confirmed Friday, December 15th, 2 p.m. Drew's on the calendar for 2:30. We're ready. 5 days until the reckoning. 5 days until I walked into that boardroom and watched my son discover that the doddering old man he'd tried to strip of everything was the majority shareholder of the company he'd spent 3 years pleading with to notice him. 5 days until I held Norma's letter in one hand and Drew's future in the other and made the call between justice and mercy. Doyle was watching me. What do you need? He asked. I need you there, I said. Monday when it happens. I need someone standing in that room who remembers who I was before any of this started. I'll be there, Doyle said. I've owed you 43 years of having your back. I'm not letting this one go. I turned the engine over and eased back onto Route 1 with Norma's letter resting on the dashboard and Doyle Cavett filling the passenger seat and the weight of December 15th pressing heavier with every mile that drew me closer to the moment I'd have to settle what my son deserved from the father he'd become. The elevator chimed on the 22nd floor like a cable pulled taut. I stepped into the glass-walled reception area of Aldrich Maritime Holdings with Doyle at my side and Norma's navy peacoat heavy across my shoulders. Below us, Salem Harbor spread out cold and bright. Those same docks where I'd given 40 years of labor diesel under my fingernails, a paycheck that came up short every December, now reimagined as gleaming corporate waterfront worth more per square foot than I'd cleared in a decade. I was carrying Norma's letters inside a scuffed briefcase that had survived 3 moves and 1 flood. The brass latches were worn smooth from a lifetime of tax forms and warranty cards and the minor paper business of an ordinary life. Doyle touched my elbow. Last chance to walk away, Walt. Norma didn't write that letter, so I could turn around, I said. Then let's see this through, Doyle said. The woman behind the reception desk rose as we came in. Mid-40s, dark hair drawn back in a clean bun. The sort of composed bearing that comes from managing other people's emergencies without showing the strain. Mr. Craddock, she said, offering her hand. I'm Petra Langley, Mr. Aldrich's executive assistant. He's asked me to bring you straight to the private conference room. She already had my name. Garrison had prepared her. I took her hand and fell in behind her down a hallway hung with photographs of ships, historic vessels, modern cargo carriers, the whole arc of New England's maritime history rendered in black and white. How long has the meeting been running? I asked. 20 minutes, Petra said, not slowing. Your son is very articulate. She opened a door to a small conference room midway down the hall. Through the wall I could hear voices muffled but present, the rhythm of a confident pitch rising and falling. Drew's voice. My son was 30 feet away on the other side of drywall and corporate insulation, making the presentation he was certain would secure his foundation's future, and he had no idea I was close enough to make out every word. Petra gestured toward the coffee service on the credenza. Mr. Aldrich asked that you wait here. Is there anything I can bring you? I declined, and she pulled the door shut without a sound. Doyle and I settled into chairs whose price tags would have covered several months of my pension, listening through the wall as my son made his pitch to a room that held the man behind this whole orchestrated confrontation. Drew's delivery sharpened on a particular point. Pieces floated through 18% program allocation, verifiable conservation metrics, 3-year track record. Doyle dropped his voice. He reminds me of who you were back then. Absolutely convinced he's got it right. That's precisely what frightens me, I told him. Doyle said it low and steady. You're not here to ruin him. You're here to pull him back from the edge. I slipped Norma's letter out of my inside pocket and held it folded unread. 5 days against my chest had made the paper body warm. 4 readings total, once at my kitchen table, the stroke of midnight, once hunched in my truck before the sun came up, once at Norma's graveside with snow coming down around me, and once this morning while Doyle stood at the coffee maker and worked hard at looking elsewhere. Every time the same words assembled themselves differently, grief reshuffling into gratitude, gratitude collapsing back into grief, and underneath it all, that unbearable precision of being wholly understood by someone no longer capable of understanding anything. She had put pen to paper 2 months before the end while her grip was still reliable and every loop and slant was recognizably Norma's. Her final line, "You'll know when the time is right. Trust yourself the way I've always trusted you." My fingers found the collar of her peacoat and I breathed in lavender, and behind it something I could never quite identify, still threaded into the fabric 3 years on because I had kept the coat exactly as she'd left it. She reached me even now from wherever it is the dead reside once they have finished saying what the living needed to hear. Then the door swung open. Garrison came in, clicked it shut, and took a long, hard look at me, the look of a man calculating whether the plan still held. "He's performing well," Walter said. Garrison said, "He's confident, no suspicion you're sitting 30 feet away." "And the trustees?" I asked. "He came with 2. Garrison said Nadine Colquitt and Clifton Wexler. Nadine, early 60s marine biologist, 15 years with the Coastal Conservation Alliance. Clifton, late 50s, spent his career as a state environmental regulator before joining the board 3 years back. The pair of them are flanking Drew at the table like parents beaming at a school recital convinced they've come to watch him ink a landmark deal. Not one of them suspects what's actually coming. "What number is Drew counting on?" Doyle asked. Garrison's smile held no warmth at all. 3 years, 400,000, each 1,200,000 on the table. His framing high-impact conservation investment, measurable coastal habitat outcomes. New England legacy brand alignment. "You've already told him yes," I said. Garrison nodded verbally pending sign-off from our primary equity partner. That's the phrasing I chose. Drew pressed on the identity, and I explained that certain investor relationships stay confidential until terms are set in stone. He let it go. He's planning to put his name on the contract before he leaves today. The hand holding the briefcase handle had begun to shake, not from nerves but from the sheer mass of what I was carrying. 39 years of silence about to end, the moment my son stopped seeing a father he'd written off and started seeing the man who held the keys to his future. Norma's letters seemed to add real weight to the case, as though what she'd written still carried force. "Ready?" Garrison asked. I got to my feet. Doyle came up beside me. "Let's do this," I said. Garrison went back through the boardroom door. I heard him through the wall, unhurried and precise. "Drew, there's one thing before we move to signatures. Our primary equity partner wants to be in the room. He'd like to meet you himself. Nothing from the other side." Then Drew's voice, quick and willing. "Of course I'd be honored." A click from the conference room intercom. Garrison's voice through the speaker aimed at Petra Langley somewhere beyond the hallway. "Send him in now." The waiting room door came open. Petra held it face arranged into careful neutrality, one hand gesturing me down the corridor toward the boardroom 30 feet away. Through the glass I could make out the back of my son's head. 30 seconds from the moment he would watch his father enter as the person who had been funding and now controlled everything he'd spent 3 years chasing. 38 years of not speaking, and it ended in the time it took Drew to rotate in his chair. I came through the boardroom door in Norma's navy peacoat, Doyle 1 step behind me. Drew was on his feet at the presentation screen, one hand still raised toward the slides, the image locked on coastal habitat restoration metrics. A shape entered his peripheral vision, and he turned ready for Garrison or Petra or any face on Earth other than the one looking back at him. The breath stopped in his throat. Garrison held his position at the table's head, the 2 trustees on either side of him. I was meeting them for the first time, a woman somewhere in her early 60s, hair gone iron gray and drawn back tight, and a man a few years younger, wire-rimmed glasses, his features arranged in the deliberate blankness of a professional witness. "Gentlemen trustees," Garrison said into the quiet, "allow me to introduce our primary equity partner, Walter Craddock." Drew's mouth shaped a word with no sound behind it, and then barely, "Dad." "Hello, Derek." I said the name Norma, and I had settled on 39 years ago in a hospital room holding a person so new to the world that he had no idea he'd already changed everything in it. 5 separate things registered on his face inside 5 seconds. I watched them arrive one by one, each like the leading edge of a tremor. The first recognition, my father. The second, wrongness, this room, this context, none of it computing. The third, the arithmetic of history. 1997, the year Garrison said the equity partner came aboard. The fourth, the financial math. Dad holds 35% of this company. The fifth, the floor dropping away entirely. I just walked my conservation pitch into my own father's boardroom. You're the equity partner. Drew's voice had gone hollow, as if he was checking whether language still worked the way he remembered. 35% since 1997, I said. Take a seat, son. This isn't... Drew cut himself off. Try it again. You can't do this. I said, keeping my voice level. And I have. Sit down. He lowered himself into the closest chair. The woman with the gray hair leaned across the table. Mr. Craddock, she said, eyes on me. Nadine Colquitt, trustee, Coastal Conservation Alliance. Our team has gone through the organizational structure Mr. Drew Craddock laid out for us. The LLC arrangements and fund allocation percentages raise significant questions. I'm aware, I said. The man in the wire-rimmed glasses followed. Clifton Wexler, also a trustee. No one disclosed any familial connection between the person presenting and the ownership of Aldrich Maritime Holdings. That information would have changed our recommendation about whether to hold this meeting at all. Garrison stayed on his feet. The board voted to reject your proposal on December 12th. 3 days ago, Drew. Today's meeting was always about delivering that verdict face-to-face and laying out certain irregularities our due diligence turned up. Drew's gaze came to me. Looking at him, I found the 4-year-old underneath the one who wanted to know why his father never came home, why his mother wept when she thought the house was asleep, why every other kid's father filled a seat in the bleachers while his own left a gap that never closed. That boy was still in there somewhere behind the polished title and the tailored presentation and 38 years of distance built like a seawall. What irregularities? Drew asked. Garrison lifted a remote. The presentation screen wiped the coastal habitat slides away and replaced them with security footage, monochrome time-stamped. June 9th, 2022. Bird's eye angle. The Maritime Conservation Gala. I sat with Drew as he watched himself work the silent auction area deep in conversation with 3 donors dressed for the evening. No sound on the footage, but the sound wasn't new to me. Garrison had run it in his office 2 weeks prior, and I had sat very still through every word my son believed no one would ever hear. The door opened again. A man in his late 50s came in carrying a canvas duffel bag, worn soft at the handles, salt and pepper hair, a suit that hadn't come off any rack, the posture of someone who spent his working life in front of judges. Mr. Drew Craddock, he said, offering a hand with no friendliness behind it. Vince Tully, counsel for Aldrich Maritime and your father. I'm also working alongside the Massachusetts Attorney General's office on certain financial irregularities within the Coastal Conservation Alliance. Drew left the hand where it was. I have no idea what's going on. You will shortly, Vince Tully said. He unzipped the bag and produced a tablet. On November 14th, your son Callum made a recording of a conversation in the parking garage beneath your Newton residence. He brought that recording to your father voluntarily on November 18th. GPS metadata places it precisely. Audio forensics found nothing altered, nothing cut. Do you want to listen? Drew looked across at me. Callum gave you a recording, he said. He loves you enough to be the one who stops you, I told him. Vince Tully hit play. Vivian's voice came into the room whole and unbroken, the acoustic character of poured concrete all around her, every syllable sharp as glass. 68 cents per dollar moving through the LF Consulting subsidiary, 18 cents reaching actual program delivery. The model holds together as long as incoming grants stay ahead of outstanding commitments. The old man's equity position gives us cover if an audit comes. Drew shut his eyes. Then his own voice out of the tablet's speaker. And if he works it out, Vivian, picking up the thread, North Shore Memory Care is holding a bed under discretionary reserve. 6 weeks for diminished capacity proceedings provided the family physician plays along. Dr. Millbrook has already put his name on the preliminary assessment. Callum signs the consent affidavit. As next of kin, we petition for guardianship and we control the trust structure. Drew's voice, he won't know what hit him. Silence on the recording. Then Callum's footsteps. I'd played that recording back 20 times and I could still hear my grandson's heart fracturing in the measured rhythm of his retreat. Vince Tully stopped playback. Recording authenticated by forensic audio specialist Annette Kwan. November 21st, GPS data and metadata verification completed November 23rd. The Attorney General's office received a copy December 1st. Drew's head dropped into his hands. Not grief realization. His son had been the one running the recorder. His 14-year-old had stood in that parking garage and caught every syllable of the plan to have Walter institutionalized and his assets brought to heel, then walked away and handed the evidence to the grandfather they'd intended to dismantle. Callum Drew breathed into his palms. He gave you this. His shoulders began to move. Whether that was laughter or something coming apart, I couldn't read it from across the table. The trustees shifted in their seats. Doyle moved toward Drew, but Garrison raised a single hand. Wait. The shaking stopped. Drew lifted his face, and I saw what those tremors had actually been. Not laughter, not quite weeping either, but the physical unraveling of a man whose version of reality had been taken apart bolt by bolt in front of an audience. Silence carries more weight than any accusation ever could. The boardroom held that silence the way still water holds light, bending it into every corner until there was no shadow left for the truth to hide behind. Garrison pushed back his chair and stood. "Take whatever time you need," he said to me, then tipped his chin toward the trustees. Nadine Colquitt gathered her portfolio and paused beside Drew's chair. She looked down at him with something that walked the line between pity and the trained detachment of someone who had just watched a colleague come undone. Clifton Wexler followed her to the door without a word. Vince Tully packed his tablet and the evidence files into the canvas duffel bag worn soft at the handles with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had documented a dozen collapses like this one and knew exactly where it went from here. Doyle rested a hand on my shoulder as he passed. "I'll be just outside, Walt." The door pulled shut. Father and son alone in a room designed for quarterly earnings and the comfortable fiction that commerce has nothing to do with the people behind it. "Derek," I said, "look at me." He raised his eyes. They were Norma's eyes, that same gray-green that shifted shade depending on where the light fell. The same shape, the inherited feature that made strangers say he favored his mother even when nothing else about him carried a trace of her gentleness. "I didn't walk in here to take something from you," I said. "Then why raw that voice? Why do it this way? Why put me through this?" "You did this to yourself, son. I only stopped looking the other way." Drew shoved back from the table, started to rise, then seemed to register that his legs weren't reliable and settled back into the chair. "You let me give that pitch. You sat somewhere in this building and listened to me stand up there asking for money. You could have come to me at any point and said nothing. I wasn't in that room," I told him. "Garrison was. I was 30 feet away listening to you work a room that had no idea who your father was or what you'd been doing to him. Do you know what that cost me?" "Your pride," Drew said, and the bitterness in it was sharp. "My dignity," I said back. On June 9th, I sat at table 18 while 250 people laughed at the punchline about the foolish old man who couldn't grasp his own irrelevance. You made me that punchline, Derek. Not once, not somewhere private. You did it in front of donors and trustees at a public gala, and in front of Callum for 3 straight years. Drew flinched. "Jokes made at the expense of people who care about us are never just jokes," I went on. "They're tests. You were probing to see if I'd push back, if I still had any reach, if the world would let you erase a man who was standing right in front of it. And when no one moved to stop you, you read that as a green light to go further still." Across the table, I could see 4-year-old Derek inside the broken man, same eyes, same set of the jaw that pushed forward when he'd been caught doing something he knew wasn't right. Same instinct to deflect rather than own it. Different choices had turned the boy into this, but the underlying shape of him was still there beneath the tailored surface. "Your son watched you make me a joke," I said, keeping my voice low. "For 3 years, Callum sat at those galas and listened to you ridicule his grandfather. What do you suppose that was teaching him about loyalty, about a man's dignity, about what it means to write off your own father in front of strangers?" Drew's hands had started to shake. "I didn't know about the equity stake. I swear I had no idea you'd—" "That's the whole problem, Derek. You never once asked what I might have been building while your back was turned. You decided I was small, so small is what I must be. You decided I had no leverage, so none is what I must have. You wrote your own version of the story and handed me the part you needed me to play, and it simply never entered your mind that I might have been writing a different story all along." "What do you want from me?" Drew asked. The words came out fractured. "I want you to understand that quiet power is knowing when to act and when to hold still," I said. "I waited 38 years, not out of weakness, but because I was building something you had no angle to see and wouldn't have understood even if I'd laid it in front of you." A knock at the door broke through. I turned. Father Delacroix stood at the threshold in the black cassock that made him look like a shadow Norma had cast from 8 years beyond the grave. He was in his late 60s now, white hair thinning at the crown, the same priest who had married us in 1978 and buried Norma in 2020 and been present at every sacrament between those 2 days. He held a thick cream-colored envelope in both hands. Derek, Father Delacroix said, his voice barely above a murmur. "Your mother asked me to bring you this when you were ready to hear it." Drew stared at the envelope. "Mom knew she knew everything," I said. "Norma called Doyle in 2000 and told him about the equity stake. She wrote that letter 3 months before she died and entrusted it to Father Delacroix with one instruction: deliver it after the reckoning when you were ready to take in her voice." Father Delacroix crossed to the table and set the envelope down in front of Drew. Norma's handwriting, deliberate and angled, slightly left. The R in Norma and the C in Craddock both formed the way she'd been schooled to write them in parochial class 7 decades ago. The priest laid a hand on Drew's shoulder, held it a moment, gave me a single nod, and slipped out without speaking. Drew set 2 fingers on the envelope, but left it sealed. I buttoned Norma's navy peacoat, took up the scuffed briefcase, walked to the door, and stopped with my hand on the handle without turning around. "Callum loves you, Derek. Don't waste what he put himself on the line to save." Dad Drew's voice cracked behind me. "I'm sorry." "I know," I said. "But sorry isn't the same as different." I walked out. Doyle was waiting in the corridor. Garrison stood near the elevator with both hands in his pockets, watching me the way a man watches something he has just witnessed but doesn't yet have words for. The elevator doors parted. I stepped in alone. The descent was quiet, 22 floors of glass and steel and morning light working across the worn fabric of Norma's peacoat. I watched Salem Harbor pull away beneath me, the docks where I'd put in 40 years. The waterfront had changed into something I only half recognized. The city moving forward, indifferent to whether I kept pace. Somewhere up above me, Drew held his dead mother's letter still unopened while his father dissolved into traffic below. I found out later that the wax seal gave way under Drew's thumb like something snapping clean. He sat alone in the emptied boardroom for 3 hours with Norma's letter while I drove home and lowered myself into the kitchen, staring at the table where she used to stand every morning, sorting the mail bills to one side, catalogs to another, and the occasional handwritten note that still found its way through in an era when most people had forgotten stamps existed. Garrison called me at 1:45. His voice was measured when he said Drew was still sitting in the boardroom and that perhaps I ought to come back. I walked back in at 2 o'clock and found my son with 6 pages of Norma's handwriting spread across the conference table and his face buried in his hands. The letter was dated March 2014, 3 weeks before she died, when her grip was still sure enough to manage a pen, but her body had already begun the slow surrender that would carry her off before April was out. The pages were cream-colored stationery, her careful script in blue ink, the edges folded soft with handling. Drew looked up when I came through the door. His eyes were red. "She knew," he said. "Mom knew everything." I picked up the first page. Norma's opening line read, "Derek, if you're reading this, your father finally had to show you who he really is. I need to tell you who I was before I understood him." Garrison stood near the window with Father Delacroix and Doyle, giving us room but staying close witnesses to whatever was about to happen next. I read standing up because sitting felt like a comfort I hadn't yet earned. Norma's words moved across the page with the same measured cadence she'd used when explaining hard things to Drew as a boy, patient, unflinching, precise as a blade. "I was ashamed of your father's hands," she wrote. "God forgive me, I wanted him polished. When we attended chamber dinners and he showed up in the same navy blazer he'd owned since 1981, I felt the burn of embarrassment when he ordered beer over wine and stumbled over French names on expensive menus. I used to wonder why he wouldn't try harder to fit the rooms we walked into. I had never known she felt that, or perhaps I had suspected it, and we'd silently agreed not to speak it aloud because naming shame gives it a power neither of us was willing to hand over. It took me 20 years to understand," Norma continued. "He kept the money secret because he knew what it would do to us. To you, wealth was the cage he'd broken out of. He wasn't going to let it close around his son. Every calloused hand, every worn coat, every time he turned down a comfort he could easily afford, he was showing you that a man's worth lives in what he builds, not in what he buys." Drew made a sound that sat halfway between a laugh and a sob. I turned to the last page. Norma's handwriting was unsteadier here, set down on a day when her body was losing ground though her mind stayed razor sharp. You measured him by money, Derek, the one thing he refused to let define him. You spent your adult years dismissing the man who loved you enough to stay invisible so you'd never feel small standing next to his wealth. He loved you enough to let you believe he had no power. You loved him so little you never thought to look. How many times had Drew corrected servers who brought the wrong wine at dinners I'd had no desire to attend, embarrassed by a father who couldn't tell Pinot Noir from paint thinner and had no interest in learning? How many times had he apologized to colleagues for how I looked, how I spoke my flat refusal to perform a polish I had never owned and wouldn't fake if I could? Norma's final paragraph cut the deepest. Smart men learn from their mistakes. Wise men learn when they break something they can't put back. Your father is giving you a choice, Derek. Choose wisely. Choose differently. Choose like the man I raised you to be, not the man you have become. The letter closed with her signature, Norma Jean Craddock, the middle name she never used except on legal papers and letters of farewell, as though formality lent weight to the words that mattered most. Drew got to his feet and crossed the room to the window, his back to all of us. His shoulders shook. I watched my son come undone and felt no satisfaction, only the press of Norma's absence, her voice still reaching both of us from 8 years beyond the grave. Still correcting our heading with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent 42 years loving men too hard-headed to ask for help. She was right, I said. She was always right about you. Drew turned from the window, tears moving down his face without any effort to stop them. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. Sorry is where we start, I said. Different is where we finish. Garrison stepped forward, holding a leather folder. The 1997 trust documents include a withdrawal clause for accumulated dividends. Your father activated it this morning. He laid papers on the table alongside Norma's scattered letter. 25 years of equity returns calculated at standard maritime industry rates. Estimated fund value $12.3 million. Drew stared at the documents without speaking. The Norma Craddock Maritime Scholarship Fund. In your mother's name, I said, for kids, like I was smart enough to build something too poor to afford the tools. Father Delacroix will govern it alongside Judge Vivian Corbin, retired from Massachusetts Superior Court Maritime Law Specialist. Neither of you need my approval or my presence. The money leaves my hands the moment these papers are signed. Father Delacroix spoke quietly from near the window. Your mother asked specifically that any fund established in her name serve students who work with their hands. She said the world spends its energy teaching children to flee manual labor, but she had married a man who proved that dignity lives in building things meant to endure. I looked at Drew. Keep the Conservation Alliance running if that's what you choose. Straighten the books honestly. Return what was diverted. Make the 18% real or close it down with integrity. Your call. But conduct yourself like someone who grasps that reputation takes decades to earn and minutes to lose. I crossed the room to where Drew stood at the window and set my hand on his shoulder. The first time I'd touched him in 38 years. He stiffened, then let the tension go under my palm. Wise men learn when they break things, I said. Out in reception, Callum waited with Doyle with no idea his grandfather had just laid down a bridge and his father was standing at one end deciding whether to step onto it. The scholarship papers rested on the table beside Norma's letter, her handwriting and legal typography, side by side. The woman who had taught us both how to measure what a man is worth and the legacy she had left behind to prove that love is the only currency that keeps compounding across generations. 7 days after the reckoning, 2 widowers sat down to dinner. Garrison chose the restaurant, an upscale Marblehead place with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the harbor and menus that listed every dish in careful script without printing a single price. The kind of room where wealth murmured instead of announced itself, where the absence of numbers was the signal that you should order whatever appealed to you without running arithmetic that might sour the evening. We came in wool blazers over button-down shirts and looked precisely like what we were, old mariners dressed up more at home with diesel fumes than with sommeliers, carrying ourselves with the particular stiffness of men who had spent their lives working with their hands, now seated in a room designed for people who hired others to do the building. Garrison opened his menu and smiled. No prices means we order what sounds good without keeping a running tally. Means you're buying next time at the diner. Deal, I said. But tonight we're marking survival. The server set down water with lemon slices and left us to it. Through the glass, Salem Harbor spread out dark and cold dock lights, throwing jagged yellow lines across the black surface. December in Massachusetts meant the dark arrived early, and the cold worked its way into your bones and held on until April made promises it wasn't in any hurry to keep. Garrison ordered seafood I couldn't have pronounced. I ordered cod because the word was simple and I knew what fish tasted like. Once the server had gone, the talk found safer ground how punishing the winter looked. Whether the harbor would freeze over by February, the exactness that marine diesel work demanded a skill most mechanics had stopped passing on because computers had shouldered out intuition. "You miss it?" Garrison asked. "The work sometimes," I said. Diesel made sense. Tighten the right bolt and the engine turns. Replace the worn gasket and the leak closes. People don't work that way. Garrison laughed. Spoken like a man who just dismantled his son's life. "Rebuilt it," I said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" From where Drew was sitting, it might have felt the same. I sat with that a moment. The food arrived plated like artwork, portions leaner than I'd expected, but tasting better than anything had a right to when it came accompanied by words like aioli and reduction. We ate in the easy silence of men who had known each other long enough that talk didn't need to fill every space. Garrison set down his fork and turned toward the harbor. Eloise hated that I worked Sundays. He said his wife's name spoken aloud for the first time all evening. Said the ships would float without me keeping watch. Told me I treated the waterfront as if it might vanish the moment I stopped looking at it. Norma hated my roughed-up hands at formal dinners, I said. Took me 30 years to understand she loved them all the same. Just wished I'd smoothed the edges enough to hold a wine glass without looking like I was checking it for cracks. Garrison smiled. They saw us more clearly than we ever saw ourselves. Two men who had built maritime enterprises sat brought low by the memory of women who had loved them anyway. Wealth buys nearly everything except one more conversation, one more morning at the breakfast table, one more chance to say what you didn't know, needed saying until the person meant to hear it was 8 years gone and the words had piled up inside you like cargo with no port willing to take them. Eloise Aldrich died 15 years ago. Breast cancer that held its ground for 3 years before winning. Norma went faster pneumonia that turned lethal in 72 hours, her lungs filling with fluid while I sat at her bedside holding her hand and pretending I wasn't watching her drown. Different deaths, the same ending. Two widowers eating expensive fish in a restaurant their wives would have adored carrying on because quitting had never once presented itself as something a man was allowed to choose. Any regrets? Garrison asked about how it all settled with Drew. I pushed the food around my plate and gave the question the honest weight it deserved. Only that Norma carried it alone for 22 years, the equity stake, the money, the secret. She'd known from 2000 on and never let on that she knew. Held it like a stone she'd slipped into her own pocket, telling herself she was shielding me from it. I would have helped carry it if she'd ever asked. Garrison nodded slow and sure, she knew that. That's exactly why she held on to it. You'd have turned the money down altogether just to spare her the load. Some women shield the men they love by carrying weight in silence. Eloise did the same with the business debts in '94, never told me how deep the cash flow hole ran until I stumbled across the second mortgage papers she'd signed without a word. They were smarter than us, I said. By half, Garrison agreed. We finished dinner. Garrison settled the bill without glancing at it. We gripped hands in the parking lot, the firm shake of two men who'd come through something together and weren't quite the same on the other side. He headed north toward Beverly. I drove south toward Salem and pulled over near the waterfront where the fishing boats used to tie up before the city converted working piers into destinations for tourists. The restaurant's warmth surrendered to December harbor cold wind off the Atlantic that cut through a wool blazer like the fabric wasn't there, carrying that mix of salt and diesel and the slow rot of old pilings. I walked to the edge of the pier and drew the second envelope from my inside jacket pocket. Norma's handwriting on cream stationery wax seal marked for my Walt when the storm passes. Doyle had passed me this one apart from Drew's letter, with instructions to open it alone once the reckoning had run its course. I broke the seal. The wax gave cleanly. Norma had used proper sealing wax, the kind that keeps its integrity across years. 3 pages in her careful hand words meant for no eyes but mine. I read, standing at the pier's edge with harbor wind working to pull the pages loose. Once through, then again, then a third time, because certain words open into new meaning when you give them room to settle. My face softened as I read. Something I'd been bracing against for years eased back from my shoulders. I smiled, unguarded, real, the first honest smile in weeks. She was a smart woman, I said to the empty harbor. Smarter than me by half. I folded the letter with care and tucked it over my heart inside my jacket. Felt the paper settle against my chest, warm from my body, carrying words that would go with me to the grave and no further. I love you too, Norma, I said quietly to the dark water and the stars above it. Always did, always will. I will never share what she wrote. Some things belong to two people only. The key went into the workshop lock, and the familiar click of it felt like returning from a long war. 12 days since I'd stood in this doorway, but the time felt far longer, measured not in hours, but in the weight of everything that had fractured and reformed between December 15th and December 27th. The door swung open on hinges I'd oiled back in October, and the space inside came back to me all at once. Workbench along the north wall, pegboard above it, holding diesel components sorted by size and purpose, every tool resting in its traced outline. The smell of motor oil and sawdust, and the particular scent of metal shaped by human hands over many years. The room looked exactly as I'd left it. Coffee mug still on the workbench, half-full diesel injector assembly spread across a clean rag, waiting for me to pick up where I'd stopped before the world came apart and put itself back together in unfamiliar arrangements. Still here, I said to the empty room. Still mine. I pulled the door shut behind me and stood breathing workshop air. No boardrooms, no lawyers, no glass towers or equity percentages or the grinding performance of being someone other than the man who understood compression ratios and torque specifications better than he'd ever understood his own son. This was who I was, not those towers, not those rooms, but this space where my hands built things that held or failed according to principles that never lied. I brewed coffee on the old hot plate percolator that had survived 4 decades of workshop use. Same grounds to water ratio my father had taught me back in 1964. The coffee burbled and hissed, filling the space with the smell of morning regardless of the afternoon hour. I poured a cup and settled at the workbench surrounded by tools worn smooth by my grip, each handle carrying the shape of my hand and its surface. The diesel injector assembly sat exactly where I'd left it 2 weeks prior. I picked up the smallest piece and turned it in the light. You don't have any interest in equity stakes or boardroom speeches, I told the machine steel. Just torque specs and compression ratios. Honest work, honest outcomes. I miss this clarity. The workshop made sense in ways people never quite would. You torque the right bolt to the correct specification and the engine turns over. You swap the worn gasket and the leak seals. Cause and effect lived here in mechanical relationships that required no interpretation, no forgiveness, no exhausting passage through feelings too layered to name. A bicycle bell rang outside. I looked up from the bench to find Callum through the window leaning his bike against the painted fence. He carried a blue tin cookies by the shape of it. His cheeks were red from the December cold, and he came up the path with the particular hesitation of a 14-year-old unsure of his welcome. Callum's bicycle bell rang out like a word for forgiveness. 14-year-old courage arriving on 2 wheels with a peace offering he had no obligation to bring because I had never once held any of it against him. I had the door open before he could knock. "Grandpa," he said. "Brought cookies. Thought you might. I mean if you want." "Get up here, boy," I said. Cold day for standing around in the yard. He came up the porch steps and followed me inside. I poured him coffee, half milk, the way he'd been taking it since he was 12, the day he decided he was old enough for workshop drinks. We settled on the porch step because the workshop held only 1 chair, and sitting outside in the December cold felt right for the kind of conversation that didn't need any elaborate setting. The cookies were snickerdoodles still warm from the bakery on Derby Street. We ate without talking. Snow started first of the season, fat lazy flakes drifting down thick and unhurried, already laying themselves across the fence I'd painted in June before any of this had begun. "Good cookies," I said. "Yeah," Callum agreed. "Snow's early this year." "Yeah." We sat there eating and watching snow pull a white sheet across the yard. 5 minutes went by without either of us reaching for words to fill the space. That's what it means to understand someone. Conversation turns optional, and silence does its own communicating. Snow covered the temporary things and left only what was built to hold. The fence, the workshop, a grandfather and his grandson with their shoulders nearly touching. Callum set down his half-eaten cookie. "Are you angry at Dad?" I gave the question the honest answer it deserved. Sad, maybe. But anger burns fuel you can't get back, and I'm too old for that kind of spending. "He's been different," Callum said, his voice measured. "Since the meeting, quieter. He shut down the shell company, paid back what was taken, told the Alliance board he's stepping away as director." "That's a start," I said. "You think he'll be okay?" "Your dad is learning to build things the right way now," I said. "Slow work, but it's the only kind that holds. He spent 38 years cutting corners, mistaking shortcuts for efficiency. Now he's finding out that foundations matter more than the face you put on them. That counts for something." Callum leaned in a little closer. You don't hate him." "I never hated him," I said. Disappointed, yes. Angry at what he let himself become, yes. But hate too heavy to carry at 71. Your father made choices that damaged people. Now he's making different ones. We'll see whether different becomes permanent or just a new kind of performance. Thanks for not hating me, Callum said. His voice came out small. For the recording. I put my arm around his shoulder and drew him close. You saved me, Callum, from my own son's scheme and my own pride's blind spots. That required courage I'm not certain I possessed at 14. You did the hardest thing a boy can do. You stood between two people you love and chose to protect one from the other. That isn't betrayal. That's wisdom. Callum's head came to rest against my shoulder. We sat watching the snow build up across the fence I'd painted 6 months before the gala. Before the investigation, before everything fractured and reassembled into shapes we were still learning to live inside. The fence stood solid beneath its white coat. Good paint, good foundation, built to last. I love you, Grandpa, Callum said softly. I love you too, boy. We worked through the rest of the cookies as the snow came down. 2 were left in the blue tin. The workshop door stood open at our backs, not concealing who I was, not putting on any kind of show, just a man existing in the space his own hands had built. Callum's breathing slowed and steadied against my shoulder. Snow went on covering the temporary things and leaving the permanent ones in plain sight. Grace tasted like snickerdoodles, and forgiveness felt like a grandson's weight against an old man's side. New Year's Day came in without ceremony, just light breaking over cold water. I stood alone on Rockport Harbor Pier at 6:45 in the morning, wearing Norma's navy peacoat against a January cold that rolled off the Atlantic like something alive and hunting. The sun crested the horizon in shades of gold and gray, first light of 2023 falling across the familiar docks where I'd put in 40 years of work. Equity stakes and boardroom reckonings had turned me briefly into someone I'd never meant to be. New year, I said to the empty harbor. Same water, same man. Everything changed. Nothing changed. That paradox settled into my bones with the comfortable weight of a truth that doesn't need explaining. 7 months since June 9th, since table 18, since I sat among 250 people laughing at jokes about my irrelevance while my son performed for an audience that would never grasp what he was actually worth until he stopped measuring himself by their approval. 7 months from humiliation through investigation through reckoning to this, a man standing on a pier in Rockport at dawn, entirely at peace. Norma knew. She'd always known who I'd still be when the noise died away. The same mechanic who'd married her in 1978 with grease still worked into his knuckles, who had promised her nothing beyond his presence, his honesty, and whatever he could raise up with his own 2 hands. She'd known in 2000 when I discovered the equity stake and chose to keep it to myself. Known in 2014 when she put those letters down on paper 3 weeks before pneumonia took her. Known from the very beginning that I would choose silence over spectacle every time because performing for rooms wore me out, and the only currency I'd ever learned to spend was the real kind. I touched the peacoat collar and felt her absence as a physical ache that had softened across 8 years, but never once left. Some losses don't close over. They become part of your load-bearing structure grief that holds up everything you construct on top of it. Table 18, I said to the sunrise. 250 people laughing felt like an ending, but it turned out to be the start of Drew finally seeing me, of Callum discovering a courage I hadn't known a 14-year-old could carry, of Norma's posthumous wisdom reaching forward from 2014 to teach us both what she'd understood for decades. Strange how spending your whole life being overlooked prepares you for one moment of being genuinely seen. I had spent 71 years practicing not to need recognition, which meant that when recognition arrived in the shape of a boardroom revelation and my son's shattered expression, I could take it in without letting it rewrite who I was underneath. I buttoned the peacoat against a wind that stiffened as the sun climbed. Salem shop, $95. Norma had talked the shopkeeper down from $120 because she held that everything was negotiable except principles. The $95 peacoat against the $95 million equity stake. One had kept me warm through 20 winters, traveled through harborside pavilion galas and Aldrich maritime boardrooms, and found its way back to Rockport exactly where it belonged. The other had nearly frozen my family to the bone before we learned how to thaw out. This coat is worth more than any equity stake, I told the harbor. Kept me warm, kept me reminded of who I am. She understood what mattered. Took me 71 years to catch up. What changed in 7 months Drew knows now. Knows what I built while he had his back turned. knows what his mockery cost, knows his son loved him enough to stop him from bringing both of us down. He's learning to build the right way. Shell company closed, diverted funds returned, the Conservation Alliance directorship relinquished. Slow work, the kind that happens out of sight with no audience and no applause. But it's the only kind that holds when real pressure gets applied. Callum's safe. The recording that kept me from ruin came from a boy who chose his grandfather's dignity over his father's approval. The hardest arithmetic a child ever has to work through. He's 14 and already grasps that love sometimes puts on the costume of betrayal, when betrayal is the only instrument sharp enough to cut someone free from their own worst momentum. Norma's name is on something that will outlast me, a scholarship fund for kids like I once was capable enough to build something but without the means to buy the tools. $12.3 million governed by people I trust to spend it right. That money will be training diesel mechanics and marine electricians and welders long after I'm gone, which means Norma's understanding of what actually matters will carry forward well past the point when both of us are dust. And I'm still here. Still the mechanic, still the quiet one who'd rather pull an engine apart than walk a Gala floor, who measures a good outcome in torque specifications and compression ratios rather than portfolio returns and social rank. That's victory enough. Identity intact despite revelation. Dignity standing after humiliation. The same rough hands that worked Rockport's docks in 1974 still fit for honest labor in 2023. Norma's absence still ached, but her pea coat across my shoulders felt like her arms there, 8 years gone, still guiding me back to the man she'd married, instead of the persona that kind of wealth could have shaped me into. The sun was fully up now, the harbor stirring around me. Fishing boats readying for the day's run, gulls wheeling above and lodging their eternal grievances over territory and scraps, cold Atlantic wind bringing salt and diesel, and the particular scent of a working waterfront that no fortune could reproduce or replace. I had spent 40 years breathing this air before equity stakes began complicating my tax returns. I would spend whatever years are left breathing it still, because place becomes identity when you've let your roots go deep enough. I turned my mind to dignity, not the performed variety that demands the right suit and fluency in wine lists, but the kind that can walk through public humiliation and come out the other side recognizably itself. Quiet power is understanding when silence lands harder than any defense. When holding back proves more strength than striking back. When leaving a fight unchallenged is the clearest proof you were never afraid of it. 40 years of invisibility taught me a currency no boardroom program could replicate. Norma taught me that. Callum reminded me of it. Drew is learning it now, the slow way, the way men learn anything worth knowing, by breaking something irreplaceable, and then standing over the pieces, deciding whether to leave them or put in the work to rebuild correctly. I turned away from the harbor and started back toward the workshop. The sun pressed warm against my back, Norma's peacoat buttoned firm, my hands deep in my pockets, carrying the particular ache that comes from 71 years of honest work. A complete stillness had settled over me, the way first snow settles. People ask quiet men what we're thinking. The answer is everything. If you've stayed with me this far, then you already understand what this story was really about. It was never about the money. It was never about winning. It was about what a man chooses to do with the time he has left after the people he loves have made him invisible. I believe God doesn't waste the years we spend being overlooked. Every quiet morning in that workshop, every gala I sat through in a borrowed blazer, every joke made at my expense in front of 250 people, none of it was wasted. It was all being added up somewhere I couldn't see. The grandpa revenge stories I hear most often aren't about rage. They're about patience so deep it looks like defeat right up until the moment it doesn't. Here is what I'd want you to take from all of this. Never confuse a man's silence for surrender. The ones who say the least are often the ones who have built the most. If someone mocks what you've built, don't correct them immediately. Let the work speak when the moment is right, and choose the moment carefully. Teach your children what you value by how you live, not by what you tell them. Drew saw my calloused hands. He just drew the wrong lesson for 38 years. And if you find yourself carrying something heavy alone the way Norma carried her secret for 22 years, consider letting someone help you hold it. Love doesn't have to be a solitary weight. These father stories matter because they remind us that dignity is not something anyone can take from you. It can only be surrendered. And some of us are simply too stubborn to let it go. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below and tell me what it stirred up. Share it with someone who's been patient longer than anyone knows. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge. There are more stories where this one came from. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.